the Northwest Territories of Canada. Vast, rugged, and untamed, were a world away from anything most people could ever imagine. I'd worked there for a couple of years as a geologist assistant with Noranda Exploration, a job that took me into some of the most remote, harsh environments you could find. I had become used to the isolation, the unpredictable weather, and the silence. But there were moments when the stillness would press in on you so heavily, you felt like you were never really alone. One summer, I found myself working with a geologist out by a lake in the wilderness. It was just the two of us, plus his mutt, a half-breed dog with a sharp instinct and a nose that never seemed to miss a thing. Our camp was primitive, basic tents, a makeshift kitchen setup, and a small Zodiac boat we used to travel around the area. The vastness of the land was staggering, the type of place where you could drive for hours and not see another human soul. The job wasn't easy. Most days, we spent our time collecting rock samples, making observations, and marking down everything we could for the main survey. But the main task, the one I dreaded most, was what we called the meat pit, a hole dug in the permafrost where we stored our food supplies, buried to keep it cool and out of the reach of animals. The constant presence of bears in the area was something you just accepted. They didn't care about you. They only cared about what you had to eat. It was always a risk, but as a team, we worked through it. Everything about that afternoon started off normal. We had just returned from a survey and were heading back to camp around 3 p.m. It had been a decent day, clear skies with the kind of crisp air that made you feel alive. But as we rounded the last bend in the lake, I saw it. Our sleeping tent, the one that we used to rest in after long days of work, was completely torn apart. I could see the poles were bent, the canvas shredded. The wind didn't have the kind of force that could do something like that. No, this was the work of something far stronger. We were deep in bear country, so we assumed the worst. A bear had come through. When we looked around, I could see a trail of disturbed earth, large paw prints around our campsite. The strange thing was, the bear hadn't touched the meat pit. It hadn't even gone near our kitchen tent. It was as if it had simply attacked our sleeping area and moved on. The adrenaline kicked in. We rushed to check the meat pit, making sure nothing had been disturbed. It was untouched. The cans and dried goods were all there. But that didn't put my mind at ease. I knew better than to think we were safe just because the bear had left our food alone. There was something strange about its behavior, and that nagging feeling that something wasn't right settled into my chest. That night, we made the decision to sleep in the kitchen tent. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being exposed in a ruined sleeping tent. We hadn't expected to stay up long, but when we got into our sleeping bags around 10 p.m., the tension was unbearable. Felt like we were being watched. The stillness of the night was broken by the sound of a branch snapping nearby. The dog, the geologist's mutt, growled low and deep. It was a sound I'd come to know, one that meant something was close. We both froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There was no mistaking it now. The bear was still around. I grabbed the rifle, and we stepped outside, scanning the darkening woods with all the intensity we could muster. The sound came again, something heavy moving in the underbrush. Then we saw it, a massive black bear. It wasn't just a bear. It was a monster, its body broad and its fur thick with the kind of wildness you didn't forget. The bear didn't hesitate. It saw us, and then it turned, its massive frame disappearing into the forest. We stayed out there for a few minutes, waiting, making sure it wasn't coming back. The mutt kept growling, its instincts sharp, but the bear didn't return. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, checking the perimeter, making sure we were secure in the kitchen tent. The next morning, we packed up quickly and decided to move the camp. It was a no-brainer, really, but we couldn't leave the work behind. We still had a job to do. So we relocated to an island on the lake, hoping the distance from the shoreline would keep the bears at bay. But even with the change in location, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly safe. The work continued, day after day, as we gathered samples and made observations. But as the days wore on, the paranoia crept in. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I'd be walking alone, my only company my knife and a can of bear spray, when the feeling would hit me. I was being watched. I'd stop, look around, but I never saw anything. Still, the unease lingered. As the days passed, the sense of danger grew. Our team had 2 other camps in the area, and one weekend, things took a turn for the worse. In one of the other camps, the workers had to shoot 3 bears in a single night. The first 2 were trying to get into the meat pit, something we all knew was dangerous, but it had never escalated to this point. The 3rd bear was more persistent, and it took more shots to bring it down. It was a close call, but they managed to drive it off. Meanwhile, at another camp on an island not far from the mainland, a bear had found its way there. The geologist at that camp had tried to shoot it, but the bear was quick. It wasn't long before the situation turned into a full-on threat, with the bear circling and getting dangerously close. They had to act fast. They finally managed to wound it, but it was still a volatile situation until the bear was finally killed. I had been a part of some tense situations, but nothing like this. The bears were becoming more brazen, more willing to take risks, and that made us all uneasy. There was one night I'll never forget. I had to go out alone to mark some geological features and check the traps we'd set for animal monitoring. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, and the sky was overcast, darkening as I worked. But it wasn't the weather that had me on edge. It was the overwhelming silence. The birds were gone. The normal sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if everything was holding its breath. I walked through the thick brush, knife in hand, my other hand gripping the bear spray like a lifeline. It felt like a dream, like I was moving through a shadow world. Every step felt too loud, the rustling of the leaves beneath my boots almost deafening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At that point, I knew I couldn't stay much longer. The tension was unbearable. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the woods for signs of movement, waiting for something to come out of the trees. 2 years I spent working in the Northwest Territories, and I can honestly say that no summer had ever been like that one. The paranoia, the constant fear, it never left. Every day I woke up expecting the worst. Every time I walked into the woods, I expected the worst. And more often than not, the worst came, whether it was a bear at the edge of camp or a strange feeling that I was being stalked. Eventually, I decided I couldn't do it anymore. I had to get out. The job ended, but the anxiety never really left. The bears in that region, the constant tension, it all added up until I realized I was no longer suited for this kind of life. I loved the work, the adventure, the land, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of always being watched, the unnerving presence of those bears that never seemed to go away. I walked away from that job, from that area, and never looked back. Some people say the wilderness changes you, and I guess they're right. It doesn't always do it in the way you expect. It wasn't the beauty of the land that left its mark on me. It was the feeling that, no matter how much you prepared, you could never be truly safe. It was the middle of spring when my wife and I decided to take a hike into the woods behind her parents' place. We'd spent the weekend there, visiting her family in the quiet, rural area. The land stretched for miles, with little to break up the dense forest except the occasional clearing or creek. It was the perfect setting for a day of trekking, peaceful, isolated, and surrounded by the sounds of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. We'd been walking for hours, just enjoying the solitude, when we came across something that felt out of place. A small, weathered cabin hidden just off the main trail. It wasn't on any map. The cabin seemed abandoned, sitting quietly in a clearing that was overgrown with thick brush. There was no sign of recent human activity around it, but something about it gave me a strange feeling. The entire area had a tense, forgotten vibe, like it had been left in a hurry and never revisited. The first thing I noticed was the barbed wire fence around it. The fence wasn't tall, only about 3 feet high, but it was jagged, as if it had been placed there to keep something or someone inside. There were no gates, just thick, rusty wire tangled up in places where it had come undone. I walked closer, my curiosity piqued, while my wife stayed back, leaning against a tree. "Maybe we should turn back," she suggested, her voice quiet, but I could hear the unease in it. She was always the more cautious one, the type who sensed trouble before it happened. I shrugged, telling her it would be fine, that we'd only take a quick look. The fence didn't seem like it was meant to keep anyone out so much as to keep things contained. As I walked closer, I could see a few tools scattered near the fence. Axes, picks, and shovels. Odd, I thought. Why leave tools like that in the open? I ducked under the wire, stepping carefully to avoid getting caught. As soon as I was inside the fenced area, I felt even more uneasy. The cabin was small, just a single room with a slanted roof and a weather-beaten porch that seemed to sag under its own weight. There were no windows, just a single door that hung slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at my wife, who was still watching me from the edge of the clearing. "You sure this is a good idea?" she called out. "Just a quick look." I called back, trying to sound casual, but I could tell she didn't buy it. Still, she stayed where she was, which gave me the freedom to push forward. I opened the door slowly, the old hinges creaking with a sound that echoed too loudly in the still air. Inside, the cabin was dark, despite the midday light outside. My eyes adjusted as I stepped in, my boots scraping against the dirt floor. The space was cluttered. Tools, old camping equipment, and piles of what looked like clothing were scattered haphazardly around the room. But the strangest part of it all were the knives. There were several on the wooden table near the door, some of them large hunting knives, others smaller, worn-down blades. They were scattered around like they had been left in a hurry. There was a stack of camouflage jackets in one corner, along with a few torn-up tarps and blankets. The place looked like someone had been living there recently, but there were no signs of a fire, no remnants of food, nothing to indicate the presence of someone who was staying there long-term. I took a step further in, my foot kicking something metal. I looked down to see a rusted canteen, its top unscrewed and lying beside a small pile of empty bullet casings. The floor was covered with dirt, but there were footprints that seemed fresh. Someone had definitely been here recently. I turned to my wife, signaling her to come closer, but she shook her head, not wanting to step into the cabin. I didn't blame her. There was something about this place that felt off, like it had been abandoned for a reason, and we were intruding on something we shouldn't have been. But I couldn't stop myself. My eyes were drawn to the corner of the room, where a set of old, faded maps were pinned to the wall. They were marked with strange notations, symbols, and circles around certain areas, some of which were marked safe, and others with ominous X marks. The maps looked like they belonged to someone who had been planning something serious. Before I could study them further, I noticed a door at the back of the cabin that I hadn't seen before. It was barely cracked open, but it led into what seemed to be a small storage area. Couldn't resist. I pushed the door open and stepped into the dark room, my senses on high alert. It was cramped, and the air smelled stale. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. A stack of ration bags, the kind you'd find in emergency preparedness kits. The bags were unopened, still sealed tight, and there were more of those knives, neatly organized on a wooden shelf. Along the walls, there were even more weapons, hunting knives, axes, and an old rifle leaning against the wall. I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread as I looked at the array of tools. It was as if someone had been preparing for something big. I backed out of the room quickly, feeling a surge of panic rise in my chest. As I stepped back into the main cabin, my eye caught something else. A notebook lying open on the table. I wasn't one to snoop, but something about the handwriting caught my attention. The notes inside the notebook were rambling and disjointed, mentioning a final day, preparations, and cryptic lines about survival. My blood ran cold. I was about to turn and head back outside when I heard a noise, rustling, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. I quickly moved to the doorway, peering out through the crack, my mind racing. Had someone been watching us this whole time? I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was overpowering. I didn't wait to find out. I stepped back outside and hurried to my wife, who was already looking anxious. "We need to go," I said, my voice low and urgent. I didn't want to scare her, but I knew we had to leave, and fast. We didn't say much as we made our way back to her parents' house. The forest seemed quieter than usual, almost too quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us, but there was nothing, no sign of movement. Still, the feeling of unease lingered. The following weeks went by uneventfully, until we started hearing rumors around the neighborhood. People began reporting break-ins, garages and sheds being ransacked, tools disappearing overnight. It wasn't long before the police found the man responsible. He had escaped from a nearby mental institution and had been living in the cabin we had found. When they caught him, he was incoherent, muttering about preparing for the end of the world, hiding in the woods, and something about survival. He was clearly unhinged. When they searched the cabin, they found it just as we had, packed with tools, knives, and all sorts of supplies for a man who was getting ready for something that never came. He'd been watching people, waiting for the right moment. It made my stomach turn. The whole time we were there, poking around that cabin, he could have been watching us. My wife and I, completely oblivious to the fact that we were trespassing on the personal space of a man who was clearly preparing for something far from sane. I shudder to think about what might have happened if we'd stayed any longer. After hearing about the man's capture, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. But the whole experience stuck with me. The more I thought about it, the more disturbed I became. That cabin, hidden so deep in the woods, had been a sanctuary for someone who was preparing for a madness I couldn't even begin to understand. It was a place built for survival, yes, but not in any way that made me feel safe. As for the tools that had gone missing, I couldn't help but wonder. Had they been taken from the homes in the neighborhood? Had we unknowingly stumbled into the lair of a man who was watching us, waiting for the right moment to make his move? I still don't know. And every time I walk in those woods, I feel a chill run down my spine, wondering if the next time I turn a corner, I might find myself face to face with someone who is still out there, still preparing for whatever he thought was coming. We used to camp all the time, my buddies and me. Some weekends we'd find new spots to check out, and others we'd revisit places we had been 100 times before. The old ones, the ones with memories. But this weekend was different. One of my buddies, Jared, told us about a place he had been to when he was a kid, a spot out in the woods he thought would be perfect for camping. He remembered it from a family camping trip and thought it'd be cool to revisit it now that we were all grown up and knew a bit more about surviving out in the wild. It was a bit of a trek to get there. We drove out early in the morning, packed up the gear, and followed the old road for about an hour, bouncing along on a stretch of gravel that seemed like it hadn't been maintained in forever. You could tell it was a road that wasn't used much anymore. Half the time we were driving through overgrown weeds that scratched the sides of the truck, making the whole thing feel like we were heading into some long-forgotten part of the world. Finally, we came to a huge clearing. It was wide open, empty, but something felt off about it. The ground was uneven, cracked in places. A local landfill had cleared the area a while back, and you could see remnants of their work. Huge piles of dirt and broken up concrete stacked up in spots. The kind of things you don't notice at first, but once you see it, it's hard to ignore. It wasn't the most picturesque place to camp, but it was what we had. The site Jared had told us about was just off to the side, and we were all anxious to explore a little more. We hiked a short distance away from the clearing, and that's when we came across a trail. It was a narrow path, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. We followed it for a while, weaving through thick trees and underbrush. The air had that crisp, earthy smell that you get in forests, with a little bit of moss here and there, and the crunch of dead leaves underfoot. There was a kind of stillness about it, as though we were walking through a place that hadn't seen many people in years. Eventually, we came to another clearing. This one wasn't clear-cut, not like the one before. The grass was tall and had that wild, untamed look. Around the edges of the clearing were stone foundations. Some were large, some small, but they were all scattered around in a way that made it clear they used to be part of something, a community maybe long since abandoned. We walked around the old ruins, picking up bits of broken pottery, remnants of what had once been homes, businesses, or something else. Some of the foundations still had old iron nails sticking out of the stone, rusty and crumbling with time. As we moved around the clearing, taking in the strange remnants of what used to be, Jared, always the one with a bit of adventure in him, said, "Okay, check this out." We followed him to the other side of the clearing, and there it was. A wall. It wasn't much anymore, just broken down sections, crumbled stone with gaps large enough to step through, but you could still tell it used to be something significant. A wall that once separated this place from whatever lay beyond it. We spent some time poking around the wall, picking through the rubble. The stones were heavy and uneven, and there was a cold, hard feeling about the place, like it hadn't been touched in a century. It felt like we had stumbled upon something that was supposed to be left alone, but none of us thought too much of it. We were used to exploring places like this. We were tough, well-prepared, and most importantly, used to seeing things for what they were, old, abandoned, and nothing more. Then we noticed something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A graveyard. It was just outside the wall on the other side. You could see the tops of tombstones peeking out from the tall grass, some of them leaning, some almost flat against the earth. There weren't many, but the few that were there felt like they'd been forgotten, lost to time. We walked closer, careful not to disturb anything, and looked at the inscriptions on the stones. Some were completely illegible, worn down by years of exposure. Others, though, were still readable, some as recent as the late 1800s. The names were faded, and the dates were hard to make out, but it was clear this wasn't just some random patch of land. These were real people, people who had lived and died in a place that now felt utterly abandoned. We stood there for a while, not saying much. It was eerie, sure, but the thing is, we weren't really scared. Maybe we should have been, but we weren't. It was just another part of the adventure, like everything else. We decided to set up camp right there, just outside the graveyard. Felt like a good spot. The land was flat, and we figured we'd have a good view of the surrounding area, in case anything unexpected happened. We didn't have much to worry about. We were just a few guys out on a weekend trip, taking in the sights, getting away from the noise of city life. We set up the tent, cooked up some hot dogs, cracked open a couple beers, and settled in. It was a peaceful night, the kind of night where you don't have to think too much, just enjoy the quiet and the sounds of the forest around you. The wind rustled through the trees, the fire crackled, and in the distance, you could hear the occasional call of an owl or the soft rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. We talked about everything and nothing, just letting the night unfold as it did. When it came time to pack up, we made sure everything was just as we found it. We didn't leave a trace behind. We made sure to pick up every scrap of trash, every beer can, every piece of food packaging. Felt like the right thing to do. If we were going to be out in places like this, we had to respect it. Leave no trace, as the saying goes. As we walked back to the truck the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something a little off about the place. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made me wonder what had really happened there, who those people were, and why they had left. The silence of the graveyard still hung in my mind, but I wasn't scared. It was just a quiet place. A place that had been forgotten by time, but not by nature. When we got back to the truck, I looked around one last time, taking in the view of the clearing, the old foundations, and the wall. It felt like we had stumbled upon something ancient, something that had been waiting for us to find it. It wasn't haunted or spooky in the way people always make things out to be. It was just old. Just a place that had lived, had been part of a story that no one was left to remember. When I tell people that story, they usually act like we were out of our fucking minds. They can't understand why we camped next to a graveyard. But to us, it was just another night under the stars. No ghosts, no goblins, no creepy things jumping out at us from the darkness. Just a bunch of guys camping, enjoying some peace, some good food, and a couple drinks. It was the kind of trip that didn't need anything more to make it memorable. The memories we made that weekend were the kind that stayed with us long after we left the graveyard behind. In the end, maybe they were right to think we were out of our minds. Maybe we were, but I still wouldn't have done anything differently. We went there, we experienced it, and we left it exactly as we found it.
No harm, no foul.
It was just a place like any other, just a little older, a little quieter. And sometimes, that's all you need to make an adventure worth remembering. I was leading a small backpacking group through the Sierras when we stumbled across something I wasn't expecting. An abandoned cabin. It was off the main trail, maybe a mile or two to the side, tucked behind some rocky ridges and sparse trees. I had taken my group off the planned route, mostly to avoid the crowds we were sure to encounter on the more popular sections of the trail. The sun was starting to dip low, casting long shadows across the rough terrain. We'd been walking for hours and were eager to make camp, but something about the cabin drew me in. It wasn't just that it was an odd find, it was the whole feeling surrounding it. The isolation, the oddness of its location, the sense that it didn't belong there, but was somehow still hanging on. The cabin itself was small, about 10 feet wide, 10 feet long, and tall enough for someone around 6 feet to stand and walk around comfortably. It was made of rough-hewn logs, their edges splintered and weathered by time. The roof sagged slightly, but it still looked solid enough from a distance. As we approached, I noticed something strange. There were windows, but no door. I had to get closer to confirm, but it looked like a small structure with no obvious entrance. A thick layer of dust and dirt had settled on the windows, making it hard to see inside at first, but through the grime, I could make out the faint outlines of empty spaces. There weren't any plants growing inside or around the cabin. No vines climbing up the walls. No weeds pushing through cracks in the wood. It was as if nothing had been allowed to take root there. Maybe it was because it was so far off the beaten path, or maybe the people who had walked by had disturbed the ground enough to keep it barren. We circled the cabin, looking for an entrance. I noticed the splintered wood and the gaps in the walls. The structure wasn't falling apart, but it had clearly been neglected for some time. There were no signs of life, no firewood, no old tools, no personal belongings. Nothing that might suggest that anyone had lived here recently or at all, really. The inside was bare, with no bed or table or chairs. Nothing that would give the place a sense of comfort or practicality. I couldn't figure out why anyone would build a cabin here, miles from any major water source, with no real shelter from the elements, no food supplies, and no sign of crops or livestock. I stood there for a long moment, just taking it all in, trying to understand. The area around the cabin was empty, No animals, no sign of any recent human activity. The only thing I could think of was that whoever had lived here had done so alone, isolated from any other people. But why here? There was no creek or river nearby, nothing that would explain how they could have survived for any significant amount of time. I had to wonder if this was some kind of remote getaway, a place to retreat to for solitude, but it just didn't make sense. Who would choose such a barren, desolate place to live? And how long had it been abandoned? The questions piled up in my mind, and I realized I had no real answers. We didn't have much time to explore, so I motioned to the group to start setting up camp. As we began to settle down, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled into my chest. There was something about the cabin that didn't sit right with me. I couldn't explain it, but the longer I looked at it, the more it felt like something was wrong, like it had been built for some purpose and then just left behind. I wanted to know more, but the day was fading and we had to keep moving forward. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, who had built it? How had they lived out here? And where had they gone? That night, as we sat around the fire, I thought back to the cabin. The crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the night filled the air, but my mind kept returning to that little building, sitting in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd discovered something we weren't meant to find. It wasn't that I thought something was inherently dangerous about the place. It was just that it didn't belong, not in the way that a cabin usually would in the woods. A cabin like that should have had a reason for existing, something to justify its presence in a place so remote. But there was no evidence of anyone having lived there, at least not in recent memory. As the fire flickered, I thought about the terrain we had crossed to get there. It wasn't exactly easy walking. The trail had been steep and rocky, with switchbacks that climbed up some snow-covered hills. Getting to that cabin had taken effort, and it felt even more surreal that someone had made that journey and then just disappeared. I didn't know whether I wanted to find answers or just leave it all behind. There were too many unknowns, and as the night deepened, my unease only grew. The next morning, we packed up early and left the cabin behind. The group didn't seem as interested in it as I was, which was fine. I didn't want to linger. We followed the trail north, continuing our journey through the Sierras. But the questions stayed with me. As I hiked, I tried to focus on the landscape around me, the towering pines and the distant peaks, but I couldn't escape the image of the abandoned cabin. I thought about how isolated it was, how far away it was from any other people, and how strange it was that something so small and simple could be out there, sitting in the wilderness, forgotten by time. Days passed and we kept moving, but I couldn't stop thinking about that cabin. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. The weathered wood, the splintered walls, the empty windows staring out into nothing. I found myself asking the same questions over and over. Had someone lived there for a time? Had they left voluntarily, or had something happened to them? Maybe they had been part of a long-forgotten mining operation or an attempt to homestead in an area that had proven too harsh to sustain life. Could have been any number of things, but the most unsettling possibility was that whoever had built it simply couldn't survive the isolation. That, or they had left for reasons I couldn't even fathom. As I sat around camp one night, the fire crackling in front of me, I thought about the cabin once more. There was no clear answer to any of my questions, but I realized something. That cabin, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed, had a story. Maybe I'd never know what that story was, but the fact that it was there, abandoned and forgotten, spoke volumes. It was a testament to the people who had lived in these mountains before us, the ones who had braved the wilderness, maybe out of necessity, maybe out of choice, but who had eventually left, leaving behind nothing but a skeleton of a building. I had no way of knowing who had built that cabin or where they had gone. But after spending so much time walking through the Sierras, I had to accept that not all questions had answers. Some things, like the abandoned cabin, just exist without explanation, and all we can do is try to make sense of them in the best way we can. Maybe that's what hiking is all about. Not just reaching the destination, but finding the stories along the way that we can't always explain. Some things don't need to be figured out. They just are. And that's enough. In the end, we moved on and I left the cabin behind. But the memory of it stayed with me, lingering like the faint smell of wood smoke in the air. And as I continued to walk through the mountains, I couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere out there, someone else would find it someday and ask the same questions I had asked, trying to figure out the mystery of the cabin in the Sierras. It was the first day of spring break, and my brother, Jay, was excited. He'd been on the orienteering team for a few years now, and this was supposed to be one of the big events, a race against other high schools in the area. They were dropped off in the middle of nowhere, given a map, a compass, and a series of checkpoints to hit in order. For those who don't know, orienteering is a test of both skill and stamina. The goal is to make it through the checkpoints in the shortest amount of time while relying solely on the map and compass. It's a race, but it's also about navigation and survival skills. Jay had done well in the past, so he was confident, paired up with his best friend, Kay, a guy who had the same level of dedication and focus for the sport. They started out with their team and things were going well. They hit the first couple of checkpoints without issue, navigating through dense woods and rough terrain. The sun was high, and it was just the kind of beautiful spring day that made you feel invincible. They laughed, joked, and pushed each other to go faster, knowing they had a chance at winning. But somewhere along the way, they missed their third checkpoint. It wasn't clear at first. They checked their compass, checked the map, and realized they had made a mistake in calculating their angle. It wasn't a huge error, but it was enough to throw them off course. They had ended up too far north. "We're way off," Jay said, as he traced their route on the map. "We should have hit that last station by now." They both checked their compasses again. It didn't make sense. They'd been sure they were on track, but now they were well into unknown territory. No trail markers, no sign of civilization. They weren't even sure if they were still on the right part of the map. The wilderness was stretching out around them, dense trees blocking any kind of landmarks. "Let's recalculate," Kay suggested, a little more nervous now. They both took a few minutes to figure out the new direction, and once they were confident, they set off again. They decided to take a more open route, cut across an old logging trail that wasn't on the map, but might cut the distance between them and the next checkpoint. But as they walked, the terrain started to change. The trees became sparse, and the ground beneath their feet softened, as though something unnatural had changed the landscape. A heavy feeling was starting to weigh on them, like they weren't supposed to be there. They could feel it in the air, in the silence that surrounded them. Nothing was moving. No birds, no rustling leaves. Then they saw it. At first, it seemed like just another depression in the land, but when they got closer, they realized it was something much stranger. A huge bowl-shaped crater, so deep that the edges looked like they had been eroded over years of heavy rains and neglect. It wasn't just the shape that was odd, though. It was what lay at the bottom of it. A rusted old ambulance. It was an unsettling sight. The ambulance was so out of place that it felt like it had been dropped from the sky. My brother told me that the moment they laid eyes on it, something didn't sit right with him. It was like something from a different era, like it didn't belong in the world they were living in. The vehicle was completely surrounded by overgrown brush and vines, the metal surface covered in rust, with faded decals barely visible along the sides. It looked like it hadn't been touched for decades. Yet there it was, sitting in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any road, and the nearest town was a few hours away. The trees around the crater were thinner than normal, like something had eaten away at the roots. It was as if the forest itself had abandoned this spot. Jay remembers how eerily quiet it was. No wind, no birds, just the odd sound of their footsteps on the soft earth. "Should we check it out?" Kay asked. "Are you kidding?" Jay replied, but despite his initial hesitation, curiosity won out. They approached the ambulance, stepping carefully down into the crater. The closer they got, the more it looked like the forest had been trying to reclaim it. Vines crawled over the body of the vehicle, and moss was growing in patches on the wheels. The back of the ambulance was partially open, the rusted doors creaking as they leaned on them. Inside, the smell hit them first. It wasn't exactly the smell of decay, but it was something close, musty, old, and heavy with the scent of earth and rot. They had to push aside more vines to get a better look inside, and when they did, Jay's stomach dropped. The interior was horrifying. There, strapped to the gurney, was an old, bent frame. The gurney wasn't just bent. It looked like something had violently twisted it in the middle. It was smashed, the metal warped in a way that was hard to explain. And that wasn't the worst of it. The walls of the ambulance were stained. Brown smears covered parts of the interior, some of them darker than others. Jay couldn't tell if it was dirt, rust, or something more sinister. There was something about the stains, the way they looked like dried liquid, that sent a chill through him. He didn't want to think about it. His mind raced with the possibilities. Maybe it was old blood. Maybe it was just dirt. But then again, why was it there, in the middle of nowhere? Why was this ambulance here? Why had it been left, abandoned in such a strange place? They both stood there for what felt like an eternity, but neither of them said a word. They both knew something was wrong. The air felt heavier, and the silence that surrounded them felt suffocating. It was like the world itself was holding its breath, watching them. Jay's heart started to race, his instincts screaming at him to leave. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't a place they were meant to find. He glanced at Kay, and without saying anything, they both turned and started to leave, backing away slowly from the ambulance. They didn't speak as they left the crater, but Jay could feel Kay's eyes on him, both of them feeling the weight of what they had just seen. They didn't even look back as they climbed up the slope out of the crater, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had no idea who would leave something like that in the middle of the woods, but something about the whole thing didn't sit right with Jay. It wasn't just the ambulance, it was everything around it, the sense of wrongness in the air. They didn't need to talk about it. They both felt it. When they made it back to the trail, they didn't slow down. They kept moving, and by the time they hit the next checkpoint, they were both breathing hard. They didn't want to talk about what they had found. They didn't want to say anything to anyone. The race didn't matter anymore. Jay still won't talk much about it. He says he knows he could probably find the spot again, but he won't. Even now, years later, he gets this uneasy look when the topic comes up. He's convinced there's something he's missing, something that doesn't make sense. The ambulance wasn't just abandoned there by some careless person or a forgotten relic of time. There was something about the whole place that didn't add up, something off about the way it had been left behind. And the stains? Jay's never been able to forget them. As for me, I'll never understand why my brother won't go back there, or why that spot in the woods still holds such a strange, sinister place in his mind. But I don't blame him for never wanting to go back, because sometimes there are places in this world that should stay forgotten. And sometimes you don't want to know what lies behind the strange things you stumble upon in the woods. It was a few days into my hike along the trail, a well-worn path through the dense forest that wound through the hills and valleys, each step carrying me deeper into solitude. I had been on my own for a couple of days, savoring the quiet. The sound of the wind through the trees was a constant, punctuated by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of something unseen in the underbrush. I had planned this trip for months, wanting the solitude of the trail to clear my head. It had been a while since I had taken time for myself, and I was determined to make the most of it. A break from the chaos of daily life. I remember that morning. It was foggy, the mist clinging to the branches like ghostly fingers. It felt like the world had slowed down, and I couldn't help but enjoy the sense of being completely cut off from civilization. My mind wandered as I hiked, thinking of nothing in particular, just walking one foot in front of the other, focusing on the path ahead. It was then I met him. I hadn't noticed him at first, but when I did, I nearly stumbled in surprise. He was an older man, dressed in a peculiar way that struck me as odd. His clothes looked like they were from another time, old-fashioned, worn in leather boots, a heavy wool coat that looked more suited for an earlier era, and a long, bushy beard that looked like it had been carefully groomed. He had a walking stick in his hand, and his face was weathered, with deep lines etched into his skin. I was surprised to see anyone else on the trail. I had passed through a few smaller campsites earlier, but no one had been around for hours. So, it caught me off guard when I noticed him standing just off the trail, as if he had been waiting for me to approach. As I neared him, he looked up and gave me a slow, deliberate nod, his gray eyes twinkling with some unspoken knowledge. His speech, when he spoke, was slow and deliberate. His words had a strange cadence to them, like Old English, though I couldn't quite place the accent. Perhaps he was British? I assumed as much at first, though the longer I listened, the more I realized it was something a little more peculiar. He told me there was a waterfall nearby, just off the trail, and that it was a beautiful spot, one that few people knew about. His words were warm, his tone inviting, and without much thought, I agreed to follow him. I had been on the trail long enough that the idea of seeing something new sounded refreshing. He turned and started off into the woods, moving with an unexpected ease through the thick brush and rocks. His pace quickened, almost as if he were in a hurry, but I struggled to keep up. The terrain wasn't easy, with uneven ground and thick foliage, and I soon found myself lagging behind. As we moved further off the trail, I noticed the air felt heavier, as though we had stepped into a different part of the forest entirely. The trees grew denser, their trunks wider and more gnarled. I could hear the sound of running water now, faint but clear, a constant rush in the background. The old man continued to push ahead, his legs moving effortlessly through the undergrowth. I began to feel the familiar sense of unease that comes when you realize you've left the beaten path for too long. The feeling crept up on me, slowly, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. But I kept telling myself that it was just a waterfall, nothing more than a nice spot to see before I made my way back to the main trail. The sound of water was becoming louder now, and I felt a surge of anticipation. But then it happened. The old man, once so close in sight, was now out of view. I couldn't see him through the thick trees and rocks, though I could still hear the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried to call out to him, but my voice felt small and swallowed by the forest. The sounds of the rushing water grew louder and louder, until they almost drowned out everything else. I kept pushing forward, the trail getting steeper as I followed the sound, my heart beating faster. I was getting close, I could feel it, but with each step I took, it seemed like the distance between me and the old man grew further. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of navigating the thick brush and craggy rocks, I saw it, the waterfall. It wasn't massive, but it was beautiful, the water cascading down from a rocky cliff into a small pool below. Mist rose up, catching the light in a way that made the whole scene feel ethereal, almost magical. But as I stood there, taking it all in, I realized something. I had lost the old man. I had walked in the exact same steps as he had, but I couldn't see him anymore. He had vanished into the woods, and for a moment, I stood there, staring at the waterfall, unsure of what to do next. I turned around and looked back the way I had come. There was no sign of him, no trace. The forest seemed eerily quiet now, the noise of the waterfall and the occasional bird call filling the silence. I started to make my way back to the main trail, but something kept bothering me. The entire time I had been following the old man, I had been walking into spider webs. Every few steps, the strands would catch my face or arms, the delicate threads sticking to my skin. It was strange because I hadn't noticed them earlier on the trail, but now it felt like they were everywhere. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but the longer I walked, the more it became impossible to ignore. It was as though the webs were being spun just for me. Each time I brushed them away, it was only to walk straight into another one. I quickened my pace, the sound of my breathing becoming louder in my ears as I tried to navigate back. The feeling of the webs against my skin grew more and more uncomfortable, as if they were clinging to me, wrapping around my arms and face. I couldn't shake the sensation, and every few moments, I would stop, sweat the air around me, and continue on, but they kept appearing more insistent than before. It wasn't until I reached the main trail again that I finally stopped, breathless and disoriented. I was back on familiar ground, but something still felt off. The sensation of the webs was still there, lingering on my skin as if they had left an imprint. I looked around, but the trail was empty, save for a few rustling leaves. The old man was nowhere to be seen. I stood there for a moment trying to gather my thoughts. Had he really been there? Had I imagined the whole thing? I shook my head, trying to push away the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The forest had a way of doing that to you, making you question what you thought you knew. I kept walking, hoping the feeling would fade as I put more distance between myself and the waterfall. But the unease lingered, and with each step, it grew heavier. The spider webs, real or imagined, seemed to follow me, the sensation never quite leaving. And as I made my way back to camp that evening, I couldn't help but wonder if I had walked into something I wasn't meant to find. I never saw the old man again, and I never did find out exactly what happened that day. But the memory of it, of him, of the webs, of the waterfall, stayed with me long after I left the trail behind. And whenever I find myself in the woods now, I can't shake the feeling that there are places out there where you're not supposed to go, where maybe, just maybe, someone or something was watching. It was around 11 p.m. on a warm autumn night, the kind where the air feels just cool enough to make you want to wrap yourself in a hoodie, but not cold enough to make you shiver. My friend and I had spent the evening at her house, just hanging out, doing the usual high school stuff, talking, laughing, joking, and occasionally looking for trouble. We decided to walk to our friend's house, a shortcut through the woods, which wasn't exactly a shortcut but more of a backwoods trail that cut through some logging roads and dense trees. The plan was to drink on the way there, pass the time, and just be out of our houses for a while. It seemed harmless enough, but as it always goes with these sorts of things, I didn't realize just how much things could take a turn. We'd walked this trail before a few times, but always during the day when the trees still let in enough light to keep you from feeling too isolated. Tonight, though, it was pitch black out there. The sky had a thin, cloud-covered sheen that didn't give off much moonlight, and the only light came from the occasional flicker of the streetlights on the distant roads behind us. We could barely see the trail in front of us, only the silhouette of each other's forms illuminated by the weak glow from the small flashlight I had in my pocket. I pulled it out, but it wasn't much help. The beam barely stretched a few feet ahead. The trail was narrow and littered with rocks and branches, the kind of path that demanded attention if you didn't want to trip. Still, we walked on. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the air. The sound of crickets and the occasional rustle in the trees above us was the only noise. It felt like we were miles away from any real civilization, and I started to feel that subtle, creeping unease that comes with being in the woods at night. The farther we walked, the more I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on us. My friend, who'd always been a bit more daring than me, was ahead by a few steps, her voice coming back to me every so often, making small talk about whatever had happened earlier that day. I wasn't really listening. I was too busy trying to keep my focus on the trail and not stumble over something unseen. That's when I heard her voice, more abruptly than usual. It wasn't playful or casual. It was sharp and serious. Holy shit! Her voice cracked the stillness of the night, and my heart skipped. It wasn't the kind of tone she used for anything casual, and I stopped dead in my tracks. She was already a few steps ahead of me, but I could see her now, frozen, looking ahead. I followed her gaze, straining my eyes into the darkness. I saw nothing at first. The trees were thick, and the trail was barely visible. But then I noticed something, movement. A shape, crouched low off the side of the trail, partially obscured by the thick undergrowth of the forest floor. It wasn't an animal. It was too big, too human. My stomach lurched, and my first instinct was to run. My friend didn't wait for me to say anything. She spun around without a word, and I followed, my feet moving faster than I ever thought I could in the dark. We ran, no, we bolted. The sound of our hurried footsteps on the uneven ground was deafening, the adrenaline making my chest feel tight as I tried to keep up with her. We didn't look back. I didn't dare to. The air was suddenly too thick, the trees too close, and the darkness felt as if it was swallowing us whole. I could hear the rustling in the trees behind us, but I didn't want to stop. Couldn't stop. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the sweat on my back, even though the air was cool. My feet slipped on the rocks, and I almost tripped, but I caught myself. The adrenaline coursing through me made me forget about the cold, about the darkness. All I wanted was to get away, to be somewhere safe. We reached her house after what felt like an eternity, my legs burning from the sprint, my breath ragged. Her parents' porch light was on, and I could see them inside, sitting at the kitchen table. The moment we got to the door, we both started talking at once, our words tumbling over each other. We managed to tell her parents enough to make them understand that something wasn't right. My friend's dad, who was always calm and unshakable, didn't hesitate. Without asking any more questions, he grabbed his shotgun and told us to stay inside. I wanted to go with him, wanted to make sure everything was okay, but my friend stopped me. She looked at me, wide-eyed and shaky, and I could tell she was just as rattled as I was. She told me to stay put. So we waited, both of us sitting on the couch, too scared to do anything but stare at the door, waiting for the sound of footsteps. I don't know how long it was before her dad came back, but it felt like hours. Finally, the door opened, and he walked in, the same calm expression on his face. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he just shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had found. "We found him," he said, and that was when I realized just how close we had come to something far worse than we imagined. The man we had seen, crouched in the dark on the trail, had been from a drug rehabilitation center about 3 miles away. He had escaped and, from what they told us later, had been wandering the woods for days, completely lost. The woods weren't exactly a place you could easily navigate, even in daylight. In the dark, it was a nightmare. He wasn't dangerous as far as anyone could tell. He hadn't been carrying any weapons or acting aggressively. He was just lost. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if we had gotten too close, things might have gone very differently. The next morning, I kept replaying the events in my head. The fear, the panic, the pounding heart as we ran back to the house. It all felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But it wasn't. It was real, and I had come face to face with how unpredictable and strange the world could be. Her dad talked to the police and to the rehabilitation center. Apparently, it wasn't the first time someone had gone missing from that place, though they hadn't had any incidents like that in years. He was safely returned, and the center took measures to make sure it didn't happen again. But in the end, It didn't change the fact that we had almost crossed paths with a man who, by all accounts, wasn't supposed to be out there. The trail we had walked was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night stuck with me, the memory of the crouching figure and the way it felt to be so completely vulnerable in the dark woods. But at least we got home safe. That whole experience taught me something I hadn't fully understood before, that sometimes things out there in the dark aren't as they seem. People can end up in strange places, sometimes because of their own mistakes, sometimes because of things out of their control. But either way, the woods have a way of hiding things, of keeping secrets, and you never know who or what you might encounter when you take the wrong path. And from that night on, I never looked at those dark woods the same way again. The night started like any other. I was in college in a small, isolated town, the kind of place where the nearest city was hours away, and the roads leading in and out were mostly empty stretches of highway. There wasn't much to do on weekends except drink, so that's what we did. Parties in rented houses, kegs in backyards, cheap liquor in red cups. It was routine. That night, I went to a party at someone's off-campus house. I don't remember much about it, just bits and pieces, flashes of memory. Loud music, people packed into a tiny living room, warm beer, the weight of a plastic cup in my hand. I must have had too much to drink because at some point my memory just stopped, like a film reel suddenly cutting to black. And then I came to. The first thing I remember was the cold. Not freezing, but sharp enough that it shocked me awake. My clothes were damp, and a chill crept through the fabric, sinking into my skin. My head pounded dull, insistent pain pressing against the inside of my skull. My throat was dry, coated in the sour aftertaste of alcohol. I was standing, swaying slightly. It was pitch dark. At first, I thought I was inside, maybe in a basement or a back room with no lights. But the ground beneath me was uneven, soft in some places, hard in others. When I moved, I felt twigs snapping under my feet. The air smelled like damp earth and rotting leaves. I wasn't inside. I was in the woods. Took a few seconds for the realization to sink in. My heart slammed against my ribs. My breathing came quick and shallow. I had no idea how I got there. The last thing I remembered was the party. Now I was in the middle of the woods, in the dead of night, completely alone. I checked my pockets. My phone was there. Relief flooded me, but it didn't last. When I pressed the power button, nothing happened. I fumbled to open the back and realized why. It was missing the battery. I had no idea how that happened. I looked around, but there was nothing but blackness in every direction. The trees were thick, their branches curling overhead, blocking out the sky. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves and my own shaky breathing. I tried to retrace my steps, but there were no steps to retrace. My legs were scratched up, my arms covered in small cuts. My shoes were caked with mud and bits of leaves. I must have been walking for a while, but I had no memory of it. Panic started to set in. I was drunk, injured, and alone in the middle of nowhere. I didn't know which way to go. The woods could stretch for miles in any direction. If I walked the wrong way, I could go deeper in. But standing still wasn't an option either. I took a deep breath and started walking. The first hour was disorienting. My balance was off, my steps unsteady. I tripped over roots, my feet catching on hidden obstacles. My hands shook from a combination of cold, fear, and the lingering effects of alcohol. Every sound made me jump. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the wind moving through the trees, my own footsteps crunching on the ground. I walked blindly, hoping I'd hit a road or a clearing, something that would tell me where I was. But the woods stretched on endlessly. Then I heard it, a howl, distant, almost too faint to be sure I had heard it at all. I froze, listening. Silence. Could have been a coyote, maybe a dog from a nearby farm, or maybe I had imagined it. I shook it off and kept walking. An hour later, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. I stopped, straining to listen. Another howl, then another, and another. Not one animal, several. The realization hit me hard. Wild dogs. I had heard stories about them before. Packs of feral dogs that roamed the outskirts of town. They weren't afraid of people. Some were strays, some had been abandoned, some were born in the wild. They hunted together, attacked together, and I was bleeding. I didn't need to be an expert to know that injured prey was an easy target. I forced myself to move faster. My legs ached, but I pushed forward, trying to ignore the burning in my muscles and the sting of the cuts on my skin. The howling came again, closer. I picked up my pace, nearly tripping over a fallen branch. I caught myself just in time, but the stumble sent a sharp pain through my ankle. I bit back a curse and kept going. The howling had changed. It wasn't just random noise anymore. They were tracking something. They were tracking me. I could feel it. An invisible weight pressing on the back of my neck. The deep, instinctive fear of being hunted. I had to get out of the woods. Fast. For the next hour, I kept walking. Every time I heard the howls, they were closer. I wasn't imagining it. They were following me. My breathing was ragged. My body screamed for rest, but stopping wasn't an option. I forced myself to keep moving, ignoring the way my limbs trembled with exhaustion. Then I heard something new. Not howling, not rustling. Footsteps, light, fast, multiple sets, moving through the underbrush. I wasn't just being followed. I was being surrounded. Panic kicked in. I broke into a run. Branches whipped at my face. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, pain exploding through my knees and palms. I scrambled up, heart hammering, and kept going. The footsteps followed. The underbrush rustled violently as something moved through it. I could hear panting. Low, heavy. They were close. Too close. I wasn't going to outrun them. I needed a plan. My eyes darted around, searching for something, anything I could use. Then, up ahead, I saw a fallen tree. I sprinted for it, throwing myself over the thick trunk just as I heard the first growl behind me. I landed hard on the other side, rolling onto my back. For a moment, everything was still. Then I saw them, dark shapes moving in the trees, low to the ground. Silent now, no more howling. Watching, waiting. I didn't wait for them to make a move. I pushed myself up and ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Then suddenly light, a break in the trees. I stumbled forward, crashing through the underbrush, and burst onto a stretch of pavement. A road, a highway. The dogs didn't follow. I stood there, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. My skin was cold with sweat, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The woods behind me were silent. I didn't stop moving. I walked along the highway, forcing one foot in front of the other. My body felt heavy, like I was made of lead. Every part of me ached. It took nearly 2 hours, but eventually, I saw lights in the distance. Campus. Home. I made it back. I don't know how I got into those woods. I don't know how long I had been out there before I woke up. But I know this. I wasn't alone. The night was colder than we expected, and the forest had taken on that eerie silence that comes after dark, where every little sound seems amplified. The only noises were our boots crunching over damp leaves and twigs, the occasional snap of a branch underfoot, and the rhythmic rustling of our backpacks as we walked. Our breath came in faint, misty puffs, vanishing into the thick air. We were deep in the woods, heading toward a place that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. We had heard about it from older friends, an old Victorian house, rotting into the earth, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of place that people dared each other to visit, the kind where teenagers went to drink, smoke, or prove they weren't scared. The house had once been part of a farm, but everything around it had fallen into ruin. The woods had long since swallowed up the fields, and whatever roads had once led to it were now just overgrown trails. It was supposed to be a fun night, just hiking out, getting stoned, maybe freaking each other out with stories. That's all it was supposed to be. The closer we got, the more the forest seemed to press in on us. The trees were dense, their branches forming a tangled canopy above. Our flashlights cut thin beams through the darkness, but beyond their reach, everything was pitch black. The trail we followed was barely visible, just a thin, worn-down path between trees. It felt like the deeper we went, the quieter it got. Even the crickets seemed to go silent after a while. Then we saw it. The house stood just beyond a clearing, a massive, decaying structure. The steep, triangular roof still held together, though parts had caved in, exposing the wooden frame beneath. The windows were dark, empty, like watching eyes. A wide front porch had once stretched across the house, but it had collapsed under its own weight, leaving jagged wooden beams jutting out at odd angles. The front door was blocked off by the wreckage, impassable. No one spoke. We just stood there, looking at it. Seeing it in person was different than hearing stories. The house looked like something that didn't belong in real life, like something from an old horror movie. Even the air around it felt heavy, stale, like it hadn't moved in years. We moved closer, stepping carefully over fallen branches and patches of uneven ground. To the right of the house, an old outbuilding lay on its side, the roof still mostly intact, forming a tilted shelter against the ground. The walls had collapsed, leaving only a hollow frame. We could see all the way through to the other side. And then we heard it. Muffled voices, low and indistinct, coming from inside the collapsed building. We stopped in our tracks. The voices were definitely real. Not the wind, not an animal, not some trick of sound bouncing through the trees. We could hear them clearly, though we couldn't make out what they were saying. It was just the steady murmur of speech, like a conversation happening just out of reach. We looked at each other. No one said anything. No one needed to. After a few moments, one of us called out. No response. The voices continued, unchanged. They didn't lower, didn't pause. It was like whoever was talking either didn't hear us or didn't care. We shined our lights into the collapsed building. The beams cut through the gaps in the walls, casting thin white streaks across the inside. There was nothing in there but dead leaves, broken branches, and damp earth. But the voices didn't stop. I felt something cold in my stomach, the kind of creeping unease that settles in when something doesn't make sense. If there were people inside, we would see them. If it was the wind carrying sound from somewhere else, it wouldn't be this clear. Then one of us stepped forward. I didn't want him to. None of us did. But we weren't going to say anything. No one wanted to be the first to admit they were scared. He crouched down and slipped inside through the tilted opening, his flashlight beam bouncing off the wooden frame. He walked slowly, picking his way through the debris. The voices were still there, deep inside the structure, as if buried beneath it. Then suddenly he stopped. There was a rustling sound beneath the leaves, a shifting of dirt. He turned toward us and shouted, "What the fuck? Guys, come here." We didn't hesitate. We scrambled in after him, flashlights sweeping across the ground. He was standing at the far end of the collapsed building, looking down at a patch of dirt and leaves. The voices were right beneath us, not coming from nearby, not from outside, from directly below our feet. We froze. For a long moment, no one moved. Then someone knelt down and started digging. The rest of us joined in, pushing aside leaves, scooping away loose dirt. It was wet and heavy, clumping together in our hands. The deeper we dug, the louder the voices became. And then we hit something solid. It was small metal. We pulled it free, clearing off the remaining dirt. It was an old crank-style survival radio, caked in grime, the plastic cracked in places. And it was still playing. A staticky voice crackled through the speaker. Something about world news, distant and distorted. The dial was set to NPR. The sound faded in and out, the words barely understandable. We just stared at it. No one spoke. We didn't need to. The radio had been buried under at least a foot of dirt and leaves. There was no way it had just been sitting there, untouched, playing this whole time. The batteries should have been dead. The entire thing should have been broken from the moisture alone. It was impossible. One of us hesitantly reached out and turned the volume knob. The voice cut out immediately, replaced by static. He turned the dial, switching stations. More static. No music, no voices, nothing. We stood there, breathing hard, our hands covered in dirt. None of us wanted to say what we were thinking, that it felt like a setup, that it felt like something was supposed to happen next, that maybe we had just stumbled into something we weren't meant to. We didn't stay. We grabbed our packs and left without another word. Walking fast, not bothering to stay quiet. We didn't talk about it until we were back on the main trail, where the trees weren't as thick and the darkness didn't feel so suffocating. We tried to come up with explanations. Someone must have buried it as a prank. Maybe another group of hikers had left it there years ago, and it had somehow survived the elements. Maybe it had been playing on a loop, just waiting for someone to find it. But none of the explanations felt right. The radio shouldn't have been working. We left the forest that night with a feeling we couldn't shake. My friend still has that radio sitting in his garage. Every once in a while we bring it up, half joking, half serious. We wonder how long it had been buried there, who put it there, and why it was still playing when we found it. None of us ever went back to that house, and none of us ever turned that radio on again. I never planned to spend a night lost in the wilderness. I wasn't some survivalist, and I didn't have a deep love for camping. I liked the outdoors, sure, but I always preferred to hike a trail, enjoy the scenery, and head back before dark. But that weekend, I made the mistake of assuming everything would go as planned. It started as a simple solo camping trip. I had a couple of days off work, and I figured I'd take a break from everything. I picked a remote spot, a canyon a few hours from the city. The area was known for its rugged beauty, winding trails, and quiet seclusion. It wasn't a place for casual hikers, but I wasn't worried. I had done my research. The plan was simple. Hike in about 6 miles, set up camp near a small river, spend a night under the stars, and hike back the next morning. It was supposed to be easy. It wasn't. The drive out was uneventful. I reached the trailhead around noon, parked my car, and double-checked my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, extra batteries, first aid kit, food, water filter, everything I needed. I even packed a little extra just in case. The trail started off easy, winding down into the canyon through a mix of tall pines and dense brush. The air smelled fresh, the sky was clear, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. A couple of hours in, the trail got rougher. The ground was uneven, full of loose rocks and exposed roots. I had to slow down, watching my step. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the canyon walls. I wanted to reach my campsite before dark, so I picked up the pace. That was my second mistake. I wasn't paying close enough attention when my foot caught on something. A rock, maybe a root, I never saw it. 1 second I was walking, the next I was falling. I hit the ground hard, my pack slamming into my back, my knee scraping against the dirt. Pain shot up my leg. I sat there for a moment, cursing myself. My knee was bleeding, but nothing felt broken. Just a scrape. I stood up, testing my weight. It hurt, but I could walk. I brushed the dirt off, adjusted my pack, and kept moving. By the time I reached the river, the sun had almost disappeared. The water was low, moving lazily over the rocks. I found a relatively flat spot near the bank and set up my tent. The air was cooling fast, and my stomach was starting to growl. I built a small fire, boiled some water, and made a quick meal. The fire crackled, sending little sparks into the night. The canyon walls loomed around me, their jagged edges barely visible in the fading light. It was peaceful, quiet. I should have enjoyed it more. It was the last moment of peace I'd have that night. I was halfway through my meal when I heard it. A sound distant at first, faint, almost like a grunt. I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth, listening. The fire popped, but otherwise, everything was silent. I shook it off, assuming it was just the river or some animal in the distance. But then it came again, closer, a deep, guttural breath. Not quite human, not quite animal. It came from the trees across the river. I turned slowly, staring into the darkness. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that, everything was black. The trees swayed slightly in the breeze, their branches shifting, but I saw nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a bear, though bears weren't common in this area. But something about the sound made my skin crawl. It wasn't a growl, wasn't a snort, just breathing, slow, deliberate. Then it stopped. The silence was worse. I waited, heart pounding, but nothing else happened. After a while, I forced myself to relax. My mind was probably playing tricks on me. I had been alone all day, walking in silence. The isolation was getting to me. I finished eating, put out the fire, and crawled into my tent. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Not wind, not an animal scurrying through the underbrush. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the dirt and dried leaves. I held my breath. The footsteps circled my tent, pausing every few steps. My heartbeat was so loud I was sure it would give me away. I reached for my flashlight but stopped. If I turned it on, whoever, whatever was out there would know I was awake. I listened. The footsteps moved away, toward the river. Then silence. I waited. 10 minutes. 15. Nothing. I barely slept after that. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the trees sent a jolt of fear through me. I told myself I was overreacting, but something felt wrong. At first light, I crawled out of my tent. Everything looked normal except my backpack was gone. I had left it just outside the tent. Now it was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through me. My food, water filter, first aid kit, everything was in that pack. I searched the area, my pulse hammering. Then I saw the drag marks, a trail in the dirt leading toward the trees. I followed it, my hands shaking. About 30 feet away, I found my backpack, torn open. The food was gone. Everything else had been rummaged through. A bear, I told myself. It had to be a bear. But bears don't walk in circles around a tent in the middle of the night. And they don't leave footprints like the ones I saw in the dirt. Human footprints. I didn't waste time packing. I shoved my remaining gear into my tent, tore it down in record time, and started hiking back. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about the soreness in my legs. I just wanted to get out. The hike back felt longer. Every sound made my skin crawl. The morning light didn't feel safe. It just made me more aware of how alone I was. 2 hours in, I heard something behind me, a branch snapping, footsteps, not an animal. I didn't look back. I just walked faster. Then, another sound. A whistle. Low, sharp, close, like someone signaling. I broke into a run. My knee screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until I could see my car through the trees. I reached it, yanked open the door, and threw myself inside. My hands fumbled with the keys, and for a horrible moment, I thought I'd dropped them. But I didn't. The engine roared to life. I slammed the door, locked it, and peeled out of there, gravel flying behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Only then did I pull over, my hands still shaking. I never reported it. What would I even say? I don't know who or what was out there. I just know I was being watched, and someone, or something, didn't want me there. I have 3 stories. First story, mid-Michigan, the concrete flats. I was a brand new Boy Scout, maybe 12 years old, and eager to prove myself. It was one of my first real camping trips, and we were in the middle of some thick Michigan woods. I can't remember exactly where, but it was deep enough that when you stepped off the trail, the trees swallowed you whole. The plan was simple: a long day hike with the rest of my troop, then back to camp before dark. The hike started out fine. It was autumn, and the ground was covered in damp leaves that muffled our footsteps. We followed a dirt path that wove through tall, skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the gray sky. I remember the air being thick, almost heavy, like it was going to rain but never did. The deeper we got, the more the forest felt the same in every direction. No landmarks, no road noise, nothing. Just trees, leaves, and silence. At some point, we realized we weren't on the trail anymore. Nobody panicked at first. We were Boy Scouts, after all, and this was the kind of thing we were supposed to handle. Someone pulled out a compass, but without a map, it wasn't much help. The sun was still up, so we kept walking, figuring we'd eventually find the path again. We didn't. Instead, we stumbled into something that had no business being in the middle of the woods. A series of enormous concrete slabs, stacked like oversized steps, overgrown with ivy and surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. The whole thing looked abandoned, forgotten. The concrete was weathered, cracked in places, but still solid. Each step was maybe 12 feet wide and about 8 feet high. They weren't stairs for people. They were too big. But for what? No one knew. Around the site, we found other strange things. A license plate from Virginia, old and rusted. Another one, yellow and skinny, probably from the UK. And car parts, bumpers mostly half buried in leaves. It was like someone had dumped pieces of vehicles here decades ago. But there were no roads, no signs of construction. The weirdest part? The air was different around those slabs. The forest had been dead quiet before, but now it felt wrong. The silence had weight, like we weren't supposed to be there. The ivy swayed, even though there was no wind. We didn't stick around. One of the older scouts decided we should move, and nobody argued. We backtracked, guessing our way through the trees, and after what felt like hours, we finally stumbled back onto a familiar trail. The moment we left the concrete behind, the forest felt normal again.
Birds chirped.
Leaves rustled. We made it back to camp before nightfall, but no one really talked about what we'd found. I've tried looking it up since, but nothing comes up. No records, no history, just a forgotten structure, sitting deep in the woods, surrounded by junk that didn't belong. Second story, Ohio, the beheaded deer. The Ohio trip was different, more laid back, the kind of camping trip where you sit around the fire at night, roasting marshmallows and telling stupid jokes. I liked waking up early on those trips, before everyone else, when the fog was still thick and the world felt untouched. That morning, I unzipped my tent just as the sky was starting to lighten. The air was cool, damp with dew, and everything was quiet. I got up, stretched, and grabbed the empty water jugs. There was a spout up the hill, maybe a 5-minute walk from camp. The fog clung to the ground, thick in places, swirling around my legs as I walked. The trees were dark, their trunks fading into the mist. I liked the stillness of it. Then I saw them, 2 deer torn apart. They were next to the water spout, their bodies twisted, gutted. One was beheaded entirely, its neck a jagged mess of red and sinew. The other had its stomach ripped open, its insides scattered like something had played with them. I froze. My brain refused to process it at first. Deer die all the time. Hunters leave remains. But this wasn't a clean kill. This was violent, messy. There were no bullet wounds, no arrows, just raw, torn flesh. I scanned the area, my pulse hammering. The fog made it impossible to see far. There were no sounds, no birds, no movement. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, then turned and walked back to camp, forcing myself not to run. I never told anyone. It wasn't that I thought they wouldn't believe me. I just didn't want to talk about it. I stayed close to camp for the rest of the trip. 3rd story, Ausable River, the pile of bones. The last trip was in Michigan again, kayaking the Ausable River. It was one of those long stretches where you paddle for hours, taking in the dense forest lining both sides of the water. The kind of place where you could go miles without seeing another person. At some point, I pulled my kayak onto a bank to eat lunch. The river was wide there, curving gently to the left, with a rocky shore that led into thick trees. I stepped into the woods, looking for a good spot to sit. That's when I found it. Clearing, dead center, a pile of bones. Not just scattered remains, this was deliberate. A mound, stacked and sun-bleached. Some pieces were large, probably deer, others smaller. A mix of ribs, spines, and skull fragments. It had been there a long time, undisturbed. I stood there, my sandwich forgotten in my hand. I don't know why, but the sight of it made me feel sick. Like I was standing somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I backed away, slow and careful, my eyes scanning the trees. I didn't want to turn my back to the woods. My mind was racing. Was this a predator's stash? A hunter's dumping ground? Or something else? I didn't eat lunch. I got back in my kayak and pushed off, paddling harder than I needed to. Final thoughts. I don't know what to make of these experiences. Maybe they're just weird coincidences. An old abandoned structure in the woods, a brutal kill site near a campsite, a pile of bones in the middle of nowhere. Maybe I just happened to be in the wrong places at the wrong times. But when I think back on them, I get the same feeling I had in those moments. The weight of silence, the sense that I was being watched, the instinct that told me to leave. I still camp, I still hike, but I trust my gut now. And when something feels wrong, I don't stick around to find out why. I used to be a parks officer in the Portland area. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was steady, and it kept me outside. I spent my nights patrolling trails, making sure no one was camping in restricted areas, keeping an eye out for illegal fires, and occasionally dealing with the people who had nowhere else to go. Some nights were quiet, some weren't. This was one of the bad ones. It was a little past midnight, and my partner, Tim, and I were walking a trail near a wooded ravine, doing a final sweep before calling it a night. The park had clear rules. No overnight camping. There were signs everywhere, and if you stayed past sunset, you were supposed to leave. But that never stopped people from trying. The homeless, the drifters, the squatters. People found spots deep in the brush where they thought no one would see them. Most of the time, they weren't a problem. We'd tell them to move along, and they'd grumble but pack up. Other times, they got aggressive. That night, we found a woman in a tent near the tree line, tucked just far enough into the woods that she must have thought no one would find her. She was maybe in her 40s, sun-worn face, greasy hair, looked like she'd been out here a while. She was pissed when we told her she had to leave. She ranted about how we were harassing her, how she wasn't hurting anyone, how she had nowhere else to go. Standard stuff. I'd heard it all before. But then, in the middle of her yelling, she said something that made me stop. She told us about a man living in a cave. Said he was bearded, filthy, hunting small animals with a homemade bow. Said he'd been out here for months, maybe years. At first, I thought she was trying to get us off her back. Make up a crazy story so we'd focus on something else. But there was something in her voice that didn't sound like she was lying. I knew this area well. I'd been patrolling these trails for a long time. There weren't any caves, at least none that I'd ever seen. Tim and I exchanged looks. If there was some guy actually living out here completely off the grid, that was a problem. If he was hunting animals, even small ones, that was an even bigger problem. We told the woman to pack up her tent. Then we grabbed our flashlights and went looking for the cave. The area she described was about a quarter mile from where we found her tent, deeper in the woods. The night was dark, and our flashlights were weak, throwing shaky beams of light over the trees. It was quiet, too quiet. Even in the middle of the night, you usually heard something, crickets, the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the brush. But here it was silent. We reached the edge of a ravine, a steep drop-off maybe 15 feet down. At first, it just looked like a pit full of trash. Old plastic bags, rusted cans, rotting cardboard. It wasn't unusual. People dumped all kinds of crap in places like this. But then, when I shined my light along the dirt wall of the ravine, I saw it. A small hole in the side of the earth, barely visible. A dark, narrow opening. It wasn't a natural cave. Someone had dug it out. The entrance was about 3 feet wide, maybe 4 feet high, just big enough for someone to crawl inside. The dirt around it was packed down, showing clear signs of being used. Everything in my gut told me to turn around, but we had to check it out. We slid down into the ravine, the loose dirt shifting under our boots. Up close, the hole looked even worse, like something out of an animal den. The air was thick with the smell of rotting meat and wet earth. I crouched down, shining my flashlight inside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small, hollowed-out space. It wasn't deep, maybe 6 feet back, but it was enough for someone to squeeze into and hide. And it wasn't empty. Scattered across the floor were tufts of animal hair, feathers, bones. A cookie tin sat against the wall, the lid barely holding on. I nudged it open with the tip of my boot. Inside was raw meat, not fresh, but not completely rotted either. Small pieces, too many pieces. My stomach turned. Tim took a step inside, moving his light across the walls. There were belongings tucked into the dirt. Old blankets, a cracked radio, a rusted canteen, a Halloween mask, an ape's face, hollow eyes staring back. It had been placed on a stick, propped against the back wall like a sick decoration. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the unease crawling up my spine. There was no bow, but this place wasn't abandoned. Someone had been here. Someone was still here. We backed out, our movements slower now, more careful. I scanned the area, my flashlight shaking slightly. I felt exposed down here, like something was watching from the darkness. Then Tim muttered something, his light fixed on a paper bag near the entrance. I stepped closer. The bag was stained dark with something. I already knew what it was before I opened it. Inside were the remains of a large bird. Maybe a hawk, maybe an owl. The body was long decomposed, bones sticking through matted feathers. There were smaller bones mixed in, rodents maybe. It wasn't just a trash pile. It was a food supply. Whoever lived here was hunting, storing meat, keeping trophies. I looked back at the cave, at the ape mask, at the cookie tin full of raw scraps. Then I looked up, at the trees above us, at the darkness beyond the reach of our flashlights. We needed to leave. We climbed out of the ravine fast, slipping on the dirt, barely keeping our footing. My heart was hammering. Every step felt like something was right behind me, reaching out, just inches away. By the time we got back to the trail, I turned off my flashlight and looked around. The forest was still silent, too silent. It hit me then. Whoever this guy was, whoever had been living down there, he could have been watching us the whole time. He could have been in the trees, in the brush, no more than 20 feet away. He could have had the bow in his hands, an arrow drawn, waiting to see what we would do. And we were unarmed, completely exposed. We left fast. By the time we got back to the truck, my skin was still crawling. We never found the guy. We never saw him, but someone had lived there, and someone was probably still out there. We didn't patrol that section of the park again for a long time. This past summer was my last summer camp with the Boy Scouts, and my first as an Eagle Scout. I'd been coming to this camp for years, working my way up from a nervous kid just trying to make it through a week away from home to one of the senior scouts who actually knew what they were doing. I knew the trails, the best places to set up camp, where to find the coldest part of the lake for a morning dip, and most importantly, how to keep younger scouts from getting themselves hurt or lost. This year, I was in charge of helping a younger scout, let's call him Jake, through the compass course. It was a standard exercise we did every summer, designed to teach navigation skills. The scouts were given a map, a compass, and a set of coordinates they had to find. The course was basically analog geocaching. They had to use the tools correctly to locate specific waypoints scattered throughout the woods. Each waypoint was usually something simple: a marked tree, a post with a symbol, or a small metal box with a stamp inside to prove they'd found it. My job wasn't to lead Jake, but to make sure he didn't get completely turned around or walk off a cliff. I was just there in case things went wrong. We set out from the main camp just after breakfast. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your back the second you step into the sun. The forest smelled like damp pine needles and earth, and the mosquitoes were already out, whining in my ears. Jake was small for his age, but he was determined. He had his map unfolded in front of him, his compass in one hand, and his brow furrowed like he was deciphering some ancient riddle. He took his time setting a bearing and pointed confidently into the woods. "This way," he said, stepping off the worn trail and into the brush. I followed, letting him take the lead. I wasn't worried. This was a well-worn course, and the waypoints had been used for years. Worst case scenario, I had my own map and compass, and if things got really bad, my phone had GPS. We'd be fine. The first checkpoint was easy: a tall pine with a metal tag nailed into the bark. Jake marked it on his map and set his next heading. We moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of camp fading behind us. It was at the third checkpoint that things got strange. The waypoint was supposed to be a wooden stake driven into the ground near a fallen log. We found the log, but the stake was missing. Jake double-checked his map, turning in a slow circle, trying to match up landmarks. "Maybe someone moved it," he said, frowning. "Could be," I said, scanning the area. "Or maybe we're just looking in the wrong spot. Let's double-check our bearing." We both took readings from our compasses, but they matched up with where we thought we should be. The stake was just gone. That was weird, but not unheard of. Sometimes animals knocked things over, or maybe another scout had messed with it. We decided to move on to the next point. That's when we saw the house. It wasn't supposed to be there. It sat just beyond a small clearing, half hidden by trees. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rotting wood, another collapsed hunting shack or an old storage shed. But as we got closer, I realized it was bigger than that. It was a full-sized house. It looked like something straight out of a fairy tale. If the fairy tale took place about 50 years after the story ended, and the house had been left to rot. Trees grew up through what had once been windows, vines curled around the sagging porch, and the entire structure looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I had never seen it before, and I had spent years at this camp. Jake stared at it. "Is this one of the waypoints?" "No," I said. "It's not even on the map." We stood there for a minute, listening. The woods around us were completely still. No birds, no wind in the trees, nothing. It felt off. "This is so cool," Jake said, stepping toward the house. "Hold up," I said. "We don't know if it's safe." The place looked like it could collapse at any second, but Jake was already climbing the porch steps. They creaked under his weight but held. I hesitated, then followed. If he was going in, I wasn't going to let him do it alone. The door was open. The inside was worse than the outside. It should have been empty, but it wasn't. Instead of dust-covered furniture or old tools, the place was full of random, modern stuff. Jewelry, TVs, game systems, even a couple of bikes, all piled in corners like someone had been using the house as a storage unit. Jake looked around, wide-eyed. "What the hell?" I stepped closer to one of the piles. Some of the stuff still had price tags on it. This wasn't just junk. This was stolen. We weren't supposed to be here. I turned back to Jake. "We need to go. Now." Something about standing there, surrounded by all that stolen stuff, made my skin crawl. The house was abandoned, but someone had been using it. Someone who might come back at any time. I grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him toward the door. We ran. Back at camp, we went straight to the campmaster. I explained what we found, leaving out the part where we actually went inside. He listened, his face growing more serious by the second, and then nodded. "I'll take care of it," he said. He called the police. Turns out, the house wasn't as abandoned as it looked. The local police had been searching for a stash of stolen goods for over a month. They had already caught the thieves, but hadn't been able to figure out where they'd hidden everything. We'd found it by accident. A few officers came out to investigate. They took statements from us and then headed into the woods. We weren't allowed to go back, but I heard later that they recovered thousands of dollars worth of stolen property. Jake and I had to restart the compass course, but he finished it and got his achievement. That was my last summer at camp. I don't know if they ever removed that house from the course, but if they didn't, I hope the next scouts who stumble across it make the right choice. And don't go inside. Camping at the pond was something we did often. It was just far enough from campus to feel like we were out in the woods, but close enough that we could get back in less than half an hour if we needed to. The area had a handful of small ponds, each with a few campsites scattered around them, mostly known to students who wanted a cheap weekend escape. My friend and I had been out here plenty of times before, always keeping things simple. Small fire, some cheap beer, maybe some fishing if we got there early enough. It was peaceful, a nice break from the stress of school. That night wasn't much different. We set up camp near the water, got a fire going, and just sat around talking. The pond was still, reflecting the night sky like a mirror. Crickets chirped in the grass around us, and every so often, we'd hear something small moving in the underbrush, probably a raccoon or a possum. It wasn't too cold, just a little chilly, the kind of night where a hoodie was enough. At some point, we started hearing music in the distance. Not recorded music, actual instruments. Drums, a guitar, and voices singing. It was coming from the other side of the trees, maybe a couple of 100 yards away. The sound carried easily over the water. It wasn't uncommon for people to party out here. Sometimes you'd hear groups drinking, laughing, playing music. Usually, they were close enough that we'd hear them, but far enough that they weren't a problem. This group sounded like they were having a good time. We could hear the rhythm of the drums, steady and hypnotic, mixed with voices singing something that was probably meant to sound deep and spiritual, but mostly came off as drunk and enthusiastic. We sat and listened for a while. I don't remember which one of us suggested gonna check it out, but it didn't take much convincing. Not to join in, just to see if we could get close without being noticed. It was just something dumb to do, a way to entertain ourselves. We left the fire burning low, just enough that we'd be able to see it when we got back, and slipped into the woods. The trees between the campsites weren't too thick, but they were dense enough to keep things dark. We moved quietly, stepping carefully to avoid breaking twigs, keeping our flashlights off so we wouldn't be seen. It was slow going at first, but our eyes adjusted, and soon we could make out enough to keep moving without tripping. The music got louder as we got closer. We could hear their voices more clearly now, the rise and fall of their singing. It wasn't bad, just a little sloppy, the way people sound when they're feeling the music more than actually performing. The drums kept up their steady rhythm, deep and primal. When we finally reached the edge of their campsite, we crouched down just inside the treeline. The fire in their camp was big, casting flickering light across the clearing. There were about 10 of them sitting in a loose circle, most of them playing something. Drums, a guitar, a tambourine, even a flute. A couple of them were just watching, nodding along with the beat. I recognized a few of them. We both did. They were people we'd seen around campus, people we knew in passing but weren't particularly close with. That made it even funnier. In a way, these weren't strangers. They were classmates, people we might see in class the next day, completely unaware that we had been watching them from the darkness. We sat there for a long time just watching. The fire crackled, the music played, and no one had any idea we were there. It was a weird feeling, being so close without being noticed. Not in a creepy way, just in a quiet, invisible way. Like we had slipped outside of reality for a little while, watching without being part of it. Eventually, we looked at each other and silently agreed it was time to go back. We moved as carefully as we had come, slipping away from the glow of their fire and into the darkness of the woods. It was even harder going back since we didn't have their fire to guide us. But after a few minutes, we saw the faint glow of our own fire through the trees. Back at our site, we sat down by the fire, grinning. That was when my friend said something that made me think in a way I hadn't before. Do you think anyone has ever creeped on us and watched without us knowing? It was an innocent question, a thought experiment. But the moment he said it, I felt something shift, because the answer wasn't just probably. The answer was definitely, and that was terrifying. I looked around our little campsite, suddenly aware of how exposed we were. We were alone out here, just two guys by a fire in the dark. Anyone could be watching from the trees right now. We wouldn't know. We wouldn't hear them. We wouldn't see them unless they wanted us to. It was so easy for us to sneak up on those people. Just two idiots wandering through the woods, stepping carefully, staying low. And if we could do it, that meant someone else could do it too. Maybe they already had. Maybe on some other night while we were sitting here talking, someone had been crouched in the trees, just watching. Maybe they were closer than we had been. Maybe they had stayed longer. Maybe they had stood just inside the shadows, listening to our conversations, watching the way we laughed and moved, close enough to hear every word, close enough to see our faces in the firelight. The idea made my skin crawl. We sat in silence for a long time after that, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every rustle in the leaves, every crack of a twig, every distant sound that could have been an animal but maybe wasn't. Eventually, we went to sleep, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, staring at the darkness beyond the fire, feeling like something was out there, just past where I could see. The next morning, everything felt normal again. The sun was up, the pond was still and peaceful, and the idea of someone watching us in the night felt silly. But every now and then, when I camp alone, I still think about it. how easy it is to watch someone without them knowing, and how easy it would be for someone to watch me. It started with the smell. I had rented the cabin for a full month, hoping to clear my head. It was deep in the woods, far enough from town that I could go days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. No traffic, no crowds, no noise. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind moving through the mountains. The first few nights were peaceful. The air was crisp, the fire kept the cabin warm, and I fell asleep easily to the distant sounds of owls and the rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. During the day, I explored the nearby trails, gathering firewood, and sometimes fishing at a creek about a mile away. Then, about a week in, I noticed the smell. It was sharp and rotten, like meat left in the sun for too long. At first, I thought something had died nearby. Maybe a deer had wandered too close and gotten caught on the rocks, or a coyote had dragged its kill somewhere near the cabin. It wasn't unusual to come across dead animals in the woods, but the smell didn't go away. Every time I stepped outside, it was there, heavy and clinging to the air. I searched the area, circling the cabin, checking near the trees, but I didn't find anything. No carcasses, no bones, no sign of anything rotting. It was just there, lingering. That night, something knocked against the cabin. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. Just a single solid knock against the wooden wall. Not a branch scraping in the wind, not an animal scratching or digging. It was deliberate. A knock. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The cabin was silent. The fire had burned low in the stove, casting weak shadows on the walls. I listened so hard my ears started to ring, waiting for another sound. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just a falling pine cone or a bird hitting the side of the cabin. Eventually, I convinced myself enough to lay back down, though it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I found tracks. Not deer, not coyote, something else. The prints were deep, pressed into the damp earth just beyond the porch. They looked human, but not quite. The shape was wrong. Too long, too narrow, and the toes. They weren't shaped like they should be. They almost looked stretched. I stared at them for a long time, my brain struggling to make sense of them. They weren't boot prints. They weren't bare feet. They were something else entirely. I followed them a few feet before they disappeared into the underbrush. The woods were dense, the ground covered in dead leaves and pine needles, and after a few yards, the tracks vanished completely, like whoever or whatever had left them had just stopped walking. I told myself it was nothing, maybe some kind of animal, though I couldn't think of any animal that would leave tracks like that. A bear? No, bear tracks were wide and round. A mountain lion? No, these had toes. I pushed it out of my head and spent the rest of the day chopping wood, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. That night, the knocking came again. 3 knocks, slow and heavy. I shot up in bed, my heart slamming against my ribs. It was right outside the cabin. I didn't move. I just sat there, holding my breath, my ears straining for any other sound. The fire had burned low again, barely more than glowing embers now, but I didn't dare move to stoke it. Then, another sound, a shuffling just outside the window. I turned my head slowly, afraid to make a noise, afraid to breathe too loud. The window was dark, nothing but blackness beyond the glass. But something was there, a shape, tall, too tall. It stood just at the edge of the window, barely visible against the night. It wasn't a person. I knew that instantly. The proportions were wrong. The shoulders too narrow, the arms too long, the head off. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just stared. It didn't move either. For what felt like forever, we stayed like that, me frozen in bed, it standing just beyond the window, barely more than a shadow in the dark. Then slowly it tilted its head. The movement was unnatural, a slow, deliberate tilt, like it was studying me. I felt something cold crawl up my spine, a primal kind of fear that I couldn't explain. Then, just as slowly, it stepped away. I heard it move, the soft crunch of leaves, the shift of dirt. Then silence. I didn't sleep. By morning, the tracks were back. More of them this time, circling the cabin. Some led to the trees, others to the creek, but all of them eventually disappeared, like before. I had enough. I packed my things, fast. I wasn't about to spend another night alone in that cabin. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. As I loaded my truck, I felt it, a weight, presence. I turned slowly. There, at the tree line, half hidden by the branches, it stood. Too tall, too thin. Watching. I didn't hesitate. I threw my gear into the truck, slammed the door, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. The cabin shrank into the distance, swallowed by the trees. And just before I lost sight of it completely, I saw it move. Not away, closer. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even now, I don't know what I saw. I don't want to know, but I know one thing for certain. I will never go back. The sun was barely cresting over the ridge when we set off, the golden light stretching long shadows across the rough dirt road. The mountains of eastern Tennessee spread out before us, thick with trees, rugged slopes, and the kind of silence you only get when you're miles from anywhere. The kind of silence that makes you feel small. I was behind the wheel of my buddy's Jeep, an older Wrangler with oversized tires and a winch bolted to the front. It rattled and bounced over the uneven trail, the suspension groaning every time we hit a deep rut. We had planned this trip for weeks, just a couple of days exploring old logging roads, riding trails that barely existed anymore. We weren't looking for trouble. We weren't expecting anything. About an hour into the ride, we crested a ridge and came to a clearing. That's when we saw it. At first, it didn't seem like much, just an old, faded red Suzuki Samurai sitting off to the side of the trail, angled slightly like it had been parked in a hurry. The paint was peeling, and the tires looked half deflated, but that wasn't what made us stop. It was the way the driver's door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I pulled up next to it and cut the engine. The quiet that followed felt heavier than before. The inside of the Samurai was empty. No bags, no food wrappers, not even an old map stuffed in the glove box. The keys were still in the ignition. The dust on the dashboard was thick, untouched. The whole thing felt abandoned. But why leave your car out here, miles from anything, with the keys still in it? I felt uneasy. There was no reason to stick around, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. Still, we weren't about to turn back just because an old car got left behind. We drove on. The road was worse past the Samurai. The ruts deepened and fallen branches littered the path, some of them big enough that we had to get out and clear them by hand. It was slow going. Every now and then, the Jeep's tires would slip on loose rock, the rear end fishtailing slightly before catching again. Maybe 10 minutes later, I saw something else up ahead. A pair of shoes. They were just sitting there in the middle of the trail, perfectly aligned, like someone had taken them off and carefully placed them side by side. They were loafers, light brown leather, the kind an older man might wear to church or a casual dinner. They were clean, too clean. I stopped the Jeep again. A weird feeling crawled up my spine. A car with the door hanging open was one thing. Shoes neatly placed on a trail this far out, that was something else. It felt deliberate. We got out looking around. The woods were thick, pressing in from both sides of the road. Nothing moved. No birds, no squirrels rustling in the undergrowth. Just silence. I turned back to the shoes, staring at them like they might move on their own. The laces were neatly tucked inside, like they had been set there with care. Whoever left them wasn't in a rush, or they didn't leave them at all. I didn't like it, but we kept going. The trail twisted and climbed higher into the mountains. It was slow going, the jeep bucking over the rough terrain. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, the kind of fresh scent that normally made you breathe deep. But now it just made my stomach knot tighter. Another 5 minutes passed, maybe more. Then we saw him, lying in the middle of the trail, flat on his back, arms crossed over his stomach. An old man. My hands clenched the wheel. I didn't pull up close, didn't want to. Instead, I stopped a good 20 feet back and just sat there, staring. He wasn't moving. We got out slowly. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel it in my throat. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the tops of the trees, but the ground around him was still. The man was old, maybe 70, maybe older. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his face was peaceful, like he had just laid down and gone to sleep. His hands were laced together over his abdomen, fingers intertwined. He was dressed neatly, dark slacks, a button-up shirt, a light jacket. He was dead. It was obvious. The air felt different, thicker. The trees seemed taller, the mountains stretching endlessly in every direction. We weren't prepared for this. I knelt down beside him, but I already knew there was no use checking for a pulse. His skin was cold, not ice cold, but that unmistakable lifeless chill. No blood, no signs of injury.
No struggle.
Just stillness. We stood there for a long time, unsure what to do. No cell service, no way to call for help. We were over 30 miles from the nearest town, probably more, and the road wasn't exactly made for an ambulance. We could try to drive back. But what then? Just leave him here? We searched his pockets, not out of disrespect, but because we needed answers. A wallet. His name was Richard, from a town over 100 miles away. There was no reason for him to be here. It didn't make sense. Later, we learned he had Alzheimer's. His family had reported him missing 2 days before we found him. He must have driven as far as he could, then abandoned the samurai when the road got too rough. Walked until he couldn't anymore, carefully removed his shoes, then continued on. Why? Did he know where he was going? Did he think he was going home? There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence that he had been attacked. He had simply stopped. Maybe he got tired. Maybe he just sat down and let go. We drove back the way we came, faster this time. The samurai still sat where we had found it, the open door swinging slightly in the breeze. The loafers were still there, untouched. It took hours to get authorities up the trail. By the time they arrived, the sun was dipping low, painting the mountains in deep purples and fiery oranges. The silence felt heavier than before. We didn't stick around. There was nothing else we could do. But that night, lying in my tent, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About the samurai, the shoes, the way he had lain so still, fingers laced, as if he had chosen that exact place to stop. Maybe in his mind he was already home. The first time I ever saw a gun up close, I was 10 years old. It wasn't in the hands of a soldier or my father or anyone who had any business carrying one. It was just lying there, hidden away in the woods, tucked inside a little case, waiting for someone to find it. That someone happened to be me and my friend. We weren't searching for weapons. We were just boys, living in a world that had become far too cruel for children. The war had been burning for years, and by that point it was nothing but a desperate fight for survival. There were no schools, no normal lives, no certainty about tomorrow. Just movement, constant movement, staying ahead of the fighting, trying to find food, shelter, anything to get us through another day. That day we were gathering firewood. It was autumn, cold enough that our breath showed in the morning air, but not yet winter. The trees had mostly shed their leaves, leaving the ground covered in a thick, crunchy carpet of brown and yellow. The smell of damp earth and decay filled the air, the way it always did when the seasons changed. We had wandered deeper into the forest than we probably should have, but caution only went so far when you were always on the run. The trees thinned a little in one spot, creating a small clearing with an old stump in the center. That's where we saw it. A little case, half buried in fallen leaves. At first, I thought it was just some lost piece of junk, left behind by someone who had passed through before us. There were plenty of abandoned things in those days: suitcases, torn clothing, rusting tin cans. People dropped whatever they couldn't carry. Some never made it back to collect what they left behind. But this case was different. It wasn't broken or scattered like most lost things. It had been placed there deliberately, tucked under some leaves, as if someone had hidden it. We hesitated. You learned quickly in times like those that touching the wrong thing could get you killed. There were traps, unexploded shells, things left behind by both retreating and advancing soldiers. We had seen what happened to people who weren't careful. But curiosity won. It always did. I knelt down, brushing away the leaves, and slowly lifted the case. It was small, made of dark leather, stiff with age and exposure. My friend watched as I unfastened the little metal clasp and opened it. Inside, nestled in a bed of old cloth, was a pistol. I had seen weapons before. I had seen men carrying them, pointing them, firing them. I had seen the damage they did, but I had never held one. The metal was cold, darker than the sky before a storm, with a wooden grip worn smooth by whoever had carried it before. It wasn't large, not like the rifles slung over soldiers' shoulders, but it had a weight to it, a presence that made my heart pound faster. It felt like something I wasn't supposed to be touching. We stared at it for a long time. For a boy, finding a gun in the woods was the kind of thing that felt like fate, like something from an adventure story. Our minds raced with possibilities. We weren't thinking about war or death or why someone had hidden it in the first place. We were thinking about how it would feel to fire it, to hear the crack of a bullet splitting the silence. We decided we would come back the next day, take it somewhere farther from camp, and test it out. We hid it right back where we found it, covering the case with leaves, making sure it looked undisturbed. We didn't tell anyone. It would be our secret. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the moment I had opened the case, the way the pistol had looked resting in the cloth, like it had been waiting there for years. I imagined holding it again, pulling the trigger, feeling the kick against my palm. I had never fired a gun before. I had only seen it done from a distance, in ways I never wanted to see again. But this was different. This was something we had found, something that belonged to no one, or so we thought. The next morning, we woke early and slipped away before anyone could ask questions. The forest was still. The damp morning air clung to our clothes as we hurried to the clearing. My heart pounded harder with every step, anticipation surging through me. We were about to do something forbidden, something dangerous. But when we reached the stump, the leaves had been disturbed. The case was gone. We searched. We clawed through the damp earth, kicked at the leaves, checked every possible hiding spot nearby, but it was nowhere. Someone had taken it. A cold feeling settled deep in my stomach, cutting through the morning chill. Someone else had known it was there. Someone had been watching or had come for it after we left. It didn't feel like we had simply lost something. It felt like we had been warned. That was the first time I realized how close danger could be without you even knowing. It was easy to see war in the distance, in gunfire, in burning buildings, in soldiers marching down the roads. But it was harder to see the silent dangers, the ones that watched from the trees, the ones that waited for you to make a mistake. We never spoke of the pistol again. We never told anyone we had found it. It was better that way. Maybe it had belonged to someone who needed it more than two foolish boys. Maybe whoever took it had been watching us the whole time, waiting for us to leave. Or maybe it was something we were never meant to find in the first place. Either way, it was gone, and I was glad. The war went on. The world burned. We kept moving. I don't know what became of that pistol. Maybe it was fired in some distant fight. Maybe it was lost again. Maybe it still sits in another hiding place, waiting for someone else to find it. But I know one thing: if I had held on to it, if we had fired it, if we had let ourselves believe for even a second that it made us powerful, things might have ended very differently. And I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Northern Arizona has a way of making you feel small. The land stretches out forever, rolling hills of pine and scrubby desert brush, broken up by the occasional rock formation jutting up like the spine of some ancient beast. The air smells dry and clean, like sun-baked earth and pine needles crushed underfoot. It's the kind of place that makes you feel like the last person on earth if you get far enough out. That's where we were, deep into a part of the backcountry that most people never saw. It had been a few days since we'd left the last signs of civilization behind. The trail we were following was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path, cutting through the trees in a way that felt accidental. It was the kind of trail you only find on old maps, the ones hikers don't bother with anymore because newer, easier routes have replaced them. We weren't the type to go for easy. There were 6 of us, carrying everything we needed on our backs. The plan was simple: spend a week in the wild, hiking deep into the backcountry, and then looping back to where we'd parked. We weren't in a rush, just moving at our own pace, taking in the quiet and the space. The only sounds were the wind in the trees, the occasional bird, and the steady crunch of our boots on the dirt. It had been a long day already, and we were looking for a good place to set up camp when we saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The sunlight filtered through the trees in a way that made everything shimmer, and for a second, I thought it was just the light catching something strange. But as we got closer, there was no mistaking it. A single tree, maybe 20 feet ahead, was on fire. Not just a little bit, not just smoking or smoldering. This tree was fully engulfed, flames climbing up its trunk and licking at the branches, bright orange against the green and brown of the forest. The flames crackled and snapped, sending bits of burning bark floating into the air, but the ground around it was untouched. The other trees, the dry brush, the pine needles littering the forest floor, none of it was burning, just the tree. We stopped, staring. This deep into the woods, there was no reason for it. No recent lightning strikes, no signs of people. The forest was dry, but not in a way that suggested spontaneous combustion. It didn't make sense. For a long time, none of us moved. There was something unsettling about it. Seeing fire where there shouldn't be fire felt wrong. We weren't reckless. A wildfire out here would be bad news for more than just us. 2 of our group turned back down the trail, heading for the closest place where they might be able to call for help. That left 4 of us standing there, watching the tree burn. We expected it to spread. The wind was light, but even a small gust should have been enough to carry embers to the dry underbrush. The flames should have crawled from tree to tree, jumping across the needles and twigs on the forest floor. But nothing happened. The tree burned, and nothing else did. The hours passed, and it kept burning. The fire moved up the trunk, stripping away bark, eating into the wood. It should have been falling apart by now, collapsing under its own weight, but it stayed standing. The heat was intense. Even from a distance, it made the air shimmer, made sweat bead on my skin. My shirt clung to my back, damp and uncomfortable, but none of us wanted to move. There was something about it that held us there, watching. We rationed our water carefully, knowing there was no telling how long this would take. We shifted our weight from foot to foot, stretching out sore muscles, but none of us left. We waited. The sun started to dip lower in the sky, and the fire was still going. The others returned just before dusk. They'd made it to a ranger station, but the only thing they'd been able to do was leave a message with someone over the radio. No one was coming right away. Maybe in the morning, maybe not. We had no choice but to stay the night. We set up camp a safe distance away, far enough that we weren't breathing in too much smoke, but close enough that we could still see the glow of the fire through the trees. We took turns keeping watch, not because we thought the fire would spread, but because none of us could bring ourselves to sleep easily with that thing still burning. By midnight, the flames were smaller, but the tree was still standing. The wood should have been gone by now, turned to ash, but it wasn't. The fire burned, and the tree stayed upright, branches blackened and curling, but not falling. I don't know how long I sat there, watching it. The others drifted in and out of sleep, but I couldn't. My eyes stayed fixed on that glowing trunk, the flickering flames, the way the fire refused to do what fire should do. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The fire was gone. The tree was still standing, but it was nothing more than a blackened skeleton now, stripped bare by the flames. The ground around it was untouched. The other trees stood just as they had before, as if none of it had ever happened. We packed up in silence. None of us talked about it because there was nothing to say. We had seen it. We had watched it burn. And yet, there it stood, charred and lifeless, as if the fire had only ever existed in that one space. We moved on, following the trail deeper into the backcountry. A week later, when we made it back to where we had service, we looked it up. There were no reports of a fire in that area. No mention of anything unusual. It was as if it had never happened. And maybe, in some way, it hadn't. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a chance to disconnect from everything. Work, responsibilities, the endless cycle of emails and notifications. Just me, the open wilderness, and the quiet. I had picked a remote spot deep in the mountains, miles away from any established campground. It wasn't my first solo trip, but it was by far the most isolated I had ever gone. The area was known for its rugged beauty, thick forests, rolling hills, and quiet lakes untouched by tourists. I had planned it all carefully, studying maps, checking the weather forecast, and packing everything I'd need. My pack was heavy, loaded with supplies, food for 4 days, my tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, a small camp stove, and my trusty knife. I even brought a GPS just in case, though I preferred using my old-school map and compass. The hike in was harder than I expected. The terrain was steep, the path barely visible in some places. Fallen trees forced me to climb over or go around, adding time and effort to the journey. The weight of my pack pressed into my shoulders, and sweat soaked through my shirt. But the deeper I went, the more peaceful it felt. The sounds of civilization faded until all I could hear was the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, and my own breathing. By the time I reached the spot I had marked on my map, the sun was starting to dip below the treetops. I was exhausted but relieved. The clearing was perfect, a flat patch of ground near a small creek, surrounded by tall pines. No signs of recent human activity, just me and the wilderness. I set up my tent quickly, the routine second nature by now, staked it down, rolled out my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going as the last light of the day faded. I cooked a simple meal, just some instant noodles and jerky, but out here, even that tasted amazing. The stars came out, stretching across the sky in a way you never see in the city. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I sat by the fire for a while, just enjoying the stillness. There was something about being alone in nature that made everything else feel distant, unimportant. Eventually, fatigue caught up with me. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped up my sleeping bag. The silence was deep, almost too deep, but I forced myself to relax. I slept lightly, waking up several times to the sounds of the forest. Branches creaking, leaves rustling. Normal noises, nothing to worry about. Then, in the early hours of the morning, something changed. I woke up to an unnatural stillness. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then came the first distant rumble of thunder. I groggily sat up, listening. The air inside the tent felt thick, heavy. I unzipped the door and peeked outside. The night was still dark, but the sky looked different, darker, heavier. Another rumble, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and checked my watch. A little past 4 a.m. The storm wasn't supposed to hit until later in the afternoon. I considered packing up and leaving, but hiking out in the dark with a storm rolling in seemed like a bad idea. I decided to wait it out. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees in sudden bursts. I could hear the storm building, rolling toward me. I zipped up the tent and lay back down, but I was wide awake now, listening to the deep, distant booms of thunder growing closer. Then the rain came. It started as a soft patter, then quickly turned into a heavy downpour, hammering against the tent. The wind howled, shaking the fabric. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me, listening as the storm crashed through the forest. Then, the first flash of lightning lit up the tent, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The ground trembled beneath me. I sat up, heart pounding. That strike had been close, too close. I scrambled for my boots, pulling them on with shaking hands. I needed to check outside, make sure my tent was still secure. The moment I unzipped the flap, the wind nearly ripped it from my hands. Rain poured down in sheets, blinding me. I flicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam around. The trees swayed violently, bending under the force of the wind. Then another flash, brighter than the last, illuminated the clearing. And that's when I saw it. A tree, maybe 50 feet away, had been split in half. Smoke rose from its shattered trunk. The bark blackened from the lightning strike. My stomach twisted. That could have been my tent. I had to move. Grabbing my rain jacket, I stuffed my most important gear into my pack: food, water, map, GPS. The rest could be replaced. I had just slung the pack over my shoulders when another blinding flash lit up the sky. The thunderclap came almost instantly, shaking the ground. I barely had time to react before I heard it, the sharp crack of wood giving way. I turned just in time to see another tree collapsing, crashing down with a sickening crunch barely 20 feet from my tent. Panic surged through me. Staying here wasn't an option anymore. I bolted, running blindly into the forest. The rain stung my face, my boots slipping in the mud. The wind roared around me, making it hard to hear anything else. I needed to find lower ground. Open areas were dangerous in a storm like this, too exposed. But running through the forest in pitch-black conditions was just as risky. Lightning flashed again, giving me a split-second view of my surroundings. I spotted a rocky outcrop to my left, slightly lower in elevation. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than staying under the trees. I sprinted toward it, slipping and sliding down the wet slope. My lungs burned, my legs screaming for relief, but I didn't stop. Finally, I reached the outcrop and crouched against the rocks, panting. The rain poured down in torrents, drenching me to the bone. My hands were shaking. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a living thing. Thunder cracked overhead, each strike making me flinch. I stayed there, pressed against the cold stone, praying that nothing else would come crashing down. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then slowly the storm began to move on. The thunder grew more distant, the wind easing. The rain lightened from a downpour to a steady drizzle. I forced myself to move, my body stiff from the cold. My campsite was ruined. My tent was crushed beneath a fallen branch, my gear soaked, but I was alive. By the time the sun rose, the storm had passed completely. The forest was eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and burned wood. I took a shaky breath, staring at the destruction around me. I had come out here for peace. Instead, I had barely made it out in one piece. I packed up what little I could salvage and started the long hike back. That was the last time I camped alone in a storm. I had been looking forward to this trip to Algonquin Park for months. The chance to get away from everything. No phone, no emails, no noise except for the wind through the trees and the crackle of a campfire was exactly what I needed. The plan was simple. A few days of camping, canoeing, and just being in the woods. We had set up camp at a spot near the water, a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The only signs of human presence were a thunderbox, a basic wooden seat over a hole in the ground, meant to serve as an outhouse, a short walk away from our site. Everything else was pure wilderness. The day had been long but good. After setting up the tent, gathering firewood, and eating dinner by the fire, the night settled in. The sky was pitch black, the kind of darkness you only get deep in the woods, with no city lights for miles. I was tired, but before heading into the tent for the night, I realized I had to use the washroom. I didn't have a flashlight. I don't know why I hadn't grabbed one. Maybe I was too comfortable by the fire, too sure of myself in the dark. I figured it was a quick trip. The thunderbox was only a short walk away, maybe a minute or so through the trees. I'd been there earlier in the day, and I thought I'd be fine. The air was cool and still. The firelight faded behind me as I walked into the darkness, the ground uneven beneath my boots. My eyes adjusted slowly. The forest was alive with the quiet sounds of night, crickets chirping, the occasional rustling in the underbrush, maybe a breeze shifting the leaves above. When I reached the thunderbox, I could barely see. I relied on memory, feeling my way along. It was eerie, sitting there in the dark, completely exposed. I had seen a moose track earlier that day, deep and fresh in the mud. There were bears in Algonquin, too. The thought of something watching me from the trees made my skin crawl. I hurried. As soon as I was done, I stood up and started back toward the campsite. That's when I heard it, a noise to my left. At first, it was just a soft rustling. I stopped. The forest went silent around me, except for my own breathing. I turned my head, trying to see through the darkness, but there was nothing. No movement, just trees, black against the even blacker sky. I started walking again, faster this time. Then, suddenly, a pack of coyotes crossed right in front of me. They came out of nowhere, moving fast and low, weaving through the trees with practiced ease. Less than 10 feet away, their bodies were just dark shapes in the night, but I could see the shine of their eyes reflecting the moonlight. I froze. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. They didn't snarl or growl, didn't act aggressive, but they all turned their heads and looked at me as they passed. Just for a second. Then they were gone, slipping into the trees like ghosts. My heart was pounding. I didn't move. Coyotes usually don't attack people, but that didn't stop the fear from settling deep in my gut. They had been so close. If one had decided to lunge at me, if I had startled them, if they had been hungry or desperate enough. I didn't wait to think any longer. I hurried back to camp, my steps quick and deliberate. The moment I saw the glow of the fire again, I exhaled, not even realizing I had been holding my breath. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I just crawled into my sleeping bag, staring at the tent fabric above me, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint yipping of coyotes echoing through the trees. That wasn't the last time I got spooked in the dark. Months later, I was walking home late at night. I lived near a small forest and an art gallery, and I often took a shortcut through the long driveway of the gallery to get home. The path was lined with tall, metal light posts, but the lights were too far apart to fully cut through the darkness. Every time I walked under one, I felt a brief sense of comfort, only for it to vanish as I stepped back into the shadows. It was cold, the kind of damp chill that settled into your clothes, your skin, your bones. The only sound was my footsteps on the pavement. Then I saw something off to the side of the driveway, just beyond the reach of the light. At first, I thought it was someone standing there. My heart skipped. It was tall, thin, with long, spindly limbs stretching into the air. But it wasn't moving. It wasn't breathing. I stopped walking. I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. It looked like a person, but it wasn't. There was something wrong about its shape, its angles. Then, in the next dim pool of light, I saw another one. And another. I realized they were wooden structures, part of some kind of art installation. I had never seen them before. No one had warned me about them. They were twisted, almost human, with long, jagged limbs, like something out of a nightmare. The way the shadows played off them made it look like they were moving, shifting, even though they were still. The worst part? I wasn't sure if they were the only ones there. The darkness around me felt heavier. I turned, scanning the trees, half expecting to see one of those things move, to see something that wasn't made of wood staring back at me. I didn't run, but I walked fast. Each time I passed another light post, I felt a little safer, but that didn't stop me from glancing over my shoulder. I didn't stop moving until I reached the edge of the forest and saw the familiar glow of streetlights ahead. I didn't look back. I don't know why those structures unnerved me so much. Maybe it was the way they appeared so suddenly, how they blended into the trees until you were close enough to see them. Maybe it was the fact that I was alone, with nothing but shadows between me and them. Or maybe it was because, deep down, some part of me was still afraid that one of them wasn't just a sculpture. That, if I had stood there too long, one of them would have turned its head. Hiking with my brother was something we had done countless times. We grew up around these woods, spent our summers exploring trails, and knew every ridge, stream, and clearing within miles of our home. It was something we were comfortable with, something that felt second nature to us. That day had started like any other. We had planned a simple hike, nothing extreme, just a few hours out and back before the sun dipped below the horizon. It was mid-autumn, the air cool but not cold, and the trees still held onto the last bits of their golden leaves. The ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen foliage, crunching softly beneath our boots as we walked. We had taken a familiar route, one that led up a small ridge before dipping down toward a shallow creek. From there, a narrow path wound back toward a dirt road where our dad could pick us up later. It was supposed to be easy, something we had done before without issue, but we lost track of time. It wasn't a sudden realization, just a slow creeping awareness that the light had changed. The golden hue of late afternoon had faded to something duller, the shadows stretching longer across the ground. The trees, which had felt warm and inviting earlier, now stood darker, their trunks blending together in a wall of silhouettes. We didn't panic, not at first. We were close to the meeting point, maybe 15 minutes away at most. But the change in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and distant rustling, had gone quiet. Too quiet. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the weight of the silence. The kind that settles heavy in your chest, making you hyper-aware of every breath, every step, every shift in the air around you. We picked up our pace, not running, but walking with more urgency. The dirt path beneath our feet was barely visible now, more of an instinctive route than one we could actually see. Our eyes adjusted to the dim light, and we focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Eventually, we reached the edge of the trail, where it met a small clearing near the road. This was where our dad was supposed to pick us up. It wasn't a proper parking area, just a wide enough space for a car to pull over. A rocky outcrop jutted up from one side, forming a natural wall that we often used to climb on during the day. Relieved, we stopped to catch our breath, standing in the clearing with nothing but the sound of our own breathing. The road was empty. Our dad wasn't there yet. I pulled out my phone. No service. Not surprising, but still frustrating. My brother wandered a few steps away, stretching his legs and shaking out his arms. I did the same, walking toward the edge of the clearing near the treeline, my eyes scanning the darkening forest. Then I heard it, a snap. Not a dry twig, not a rustle of leaves, but something solid. A branch, a heavy, deliberate break. I turned toward the sound, my eyes straining in the low light. At first, I thought it was my brother, but then his voice came from behind me. "What are you doing, bro?" He was standing several feet away, nowhere near the noise. And that's when it hit us. We weren't alone. The silence returned, heavier than before. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breath shallow as I listened. We didn't see anything. No movement, no obvious shape in the trees. But something was out there. The feeling that settled in my gut was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the fear of being watched. It was the sheer, instinctive dread that comes when you know you're too exposed. We moved at the same time, barely exchanging a glance before sprinting for the rock wall. We scrambled up, gripping at anything we could, pulling ourselves higher with the kind of speed and desperation that only comes when fear takes full control. The rough stones scraped against our palms, our fingers digging into cracks, our feet scrambling for purchase. By the time we reached the top, we turned and looked down. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The trees stood still. There was no movement, no sound. Just the lingering sense that something was still there, hidden, watching. We stayed put, barely breathing, our bodies tense as we scanned the darkness below. Minutes passed, then more. The night settled in fully, swallowing the last remnants of daylight. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon, casting long, uneven shadows across the ground. Still, nothing moved. The fear didn't fade, but our bodies began to ache from staying still. Every muscle was tight, every nerve on edge, but we refused to climb down. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We just waited. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw headlights approaching from the distance. The familiar rumble of our dad's car cut through the silence, the sound sending a wave of relief through me. We climbed down, moving quickly but cautiously, still half expecting something to lunge from the darkness. As soon as we reached the ground, we ran to the car, pulling open the door and jumping inside. The interior light was blinding after so much darkness, making us squint as we slammed the door shut. Our dad looked at us, confused by our urgency. We barely registered his reaction. "Point the lights at the woods," we said. He hesitated but did as we asked, turning the wheel slightly so the headlights flooded the clearing and the edge of the forest. That's when we saw it. A branch, fresh and green, thick as an arm, snapped clean in half. We stared at it, our minds trying to process what we were looking at. It wasn't an old, dead limb. It wasn't something that had fallen naturally. Something had broken it, and whatever did it had done so without making another sound. There were no animals in our country that could break a branch like that, not without us hearing them move. No bears, no large predators, nothing. The realization settled over us, heavy and cold. We still don't have an explanation for what happened that night. We've told the story to friends, to family, to anyone who would listen. Everyone offers their theories, a freak accident, a coincidence, maybe even our own paranoia playing tricks on us. But none of it explains the silence. None of it explains how something big enough to snap a healthy branch stayed completely unseen and unheard. And none of it changes the fact that, even now, I still think about that night every time I step into the woods. Camping in the Northern Territory was supposed to be an adventure. I'd been on trips before, but nothing quite like this. 4 girls, just us, out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by red dirt, scattered gum trees, and the endless sounds of the Australian bush. It was the kind of place where the night sky stretched on forever, where you could feel the weight of the quiet pressing down on you when the wind died. Beautiful but unsettling. The 4 of us, me, Steph, Rachel, and Jess, had set up camp earlier in the afternoon at a remote site, miles from the nearest town. It was basic, just a clearing with a few fire pits and a creek nearby. We knew better than to get too close to the water, though. This was croc country. You didn't take risks out here. We'd barely gotten settled when we noticed him. An old guy, alone, camping just a little too close to us. It wasn't unusual to see solo travelers, especially out here, but something about him felt off. He was watching us, not obviously staring, but in a way that made it clear he knew we were there. We tried to ignore him and focused on setting up. We pitched our tents, collected firewood, and got ready for the night. By sunset, we had a fire going, and as we sat around eating our dinner, he wandered over. He didn't ask. He just sat down. I kept my head down, focusing on my food, hoping he'd get the hint and leave. But he didn't. He started talking about himself, his travels, his life. He went on and on, barely stopping for breath, never once asking us anything. I couldn't even tell if he noticed how little we were responding. His presence shifted the energy in our little circle. None of us were comfortable, but none of us wanted to be outright rude. Then he invited us for a midnight swim. I knew that creek was full of crocs. Even if it wasn't, there was no way in hell I was following a strange man into pitch black water in the middle of nowhere. But he was looking at us like it was the most normal suggestion in the world. Like he really expected us to say yes. We mumbled some excuse, and he didn't push, but I saw the way his eyes lingered on us before he dropped it. After that, Steph got up to grab her camera. The fire looked good against the night, and she wanted to take some photos. That's when he spoke again, offering to take a picture of us together. We hesitated, but it felt rude to say no. So we huddled by the fire, forcing smiles, while he snapped a quick photo. Then he said, "Your camera doesn't have the motion setting mine does." And he disappeared into his tent. When he came back, he wasn't just taking 1 or 2 photos. He was taking loads. We weren't even posing anymore, just standing there, shifting awkwardly while he clicked away. His focus wasn't on the fire or the scenery. It was on us. None of us wanted to make a scene, especially since we had to spend the night here. If he got pissed off, if he decided to make a problem for us, we were alone. There was no one to call for help, so we let him take his pictures. Eventually, we said we were heading to bed. I lay in my tent, exhausted but too wired to sleep. I could hear the crackle of the dying fire, the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. Every sound felt louder, sharper. I listened for movement, waiting for the moment he'd finally head back to his own camp. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving closer. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The footsteps stopped just outside our tents. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. After what felt like forever, the footsteps started again, moving away this time. I wanted to believe I imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. In the morning, Rachel was the first to ask, Did anyone else hear footsteps last night? All four of us had. We packed up fast. The sun had barely risen, but none of us wanted to stay a second longer. As we were getting ready to leave, we spotted him. He was passed out outside his tent. Not inside, not on a sleeping mat, just lying there on the dirt like he'd collapsed. We didn't say a word. We just got in the car and got the hell out of there. This was my first summer working for the National Park Service. I had always imagined the job as long days in the woods, maintaining trails, guiding hikers, and making sure tourists didn't do anything too stupid. And for the most part, that was true. But nothing prepared me for the other side of the job, the one they don't talk about in the training manuals. The side where people die, and sometimes we're the ones who have to find them. Sequoia National Park is vast. It's easy to think of it as a well-mapped wilderness, but there are stretches of land that few people have ever set foot in. The terrain is unforgiving. Steep cliffs, dense forests, and deep snow in the winter that can bury entire sections of the park under several feet of ice. When someone goes missing out there, it's not always a matter of if they'll be found. Sometimes it's a matter of when and in what condition. I wasn't on the search and rescue SAR team that found him, but the story spread quickly among the seasonal workers, passed along in quiet conversations over evening meals, in the storage sheds where we kept the gear, or out on the trails as we worked. It was one of those stories that stuck with you, the kind that made you think twice when you stepped off the beaten path. The guy had gone missing last winter. He and his friend had been out hiking when a snowstorm rolled in. Happens all the time. People underestimate how fast the weather changes up here. 1 minute it's clear, the next you're caught in whiteout conditions with no visibility and temperatures dropping fast. His partner got lucky. He found his way back, but when he realized his friend was no longer behind him, he called for help. The SAR team was out there for nearly 2 weeks, searching in the brutal cold, but they never found him. After a while, when there's that much snow, you have to assume the worst. Either he had wandered too far, gotten lost, and froze to death, or he had fallen somewhere we'd never find him. Maybe he had even decided to disappear, just another hiker who wanted to leave everything behind. It happens more than you'd think. But then the snow melted. In the spring, when the high elevation started to thaw out, the SAR team went out again. Not with much hope, but because it's procedure. Sometimes, when the snow recedes, it gives up the bodies it swallowed in the winter. And this time, it did. I wasn't there when they found him, but I saw the pictures. They weren't the kind of thing you forget. His body had been torn apart. Wildlife had gotten to him, scattering his remains across the rocky slope where he had finally collapsed. Animals don't care that you were once a person. Out here, once you die, you're just another part of the food chain. His torso was mostly intact, though his ribs were exposed, the skin and muscle picked clean in places. His skull had been dragged several yards away. One arm was missing. His legs were still there, but the boots had been chewed apart, his feet gnawed to the bone. The smell must have been unbearable when they found him. Even with the dry mountain air, death lingers. It gets in your clothes, in your nose. The team had to gather his remains piece by piece, carefully placing what was left into body bags. They didn't find all of him. Some parts had probably been carried off miles away. After that, they brought what they could back down the mountain. It was the end of the story, at least for us. The official report would be filed, the next of kin notified, and eventually people would stop talking about it. But I couldn't stop thinking about how long he must have lasted out there, how much he suffered. Did he sit against a tree, slowly freezing, knowing that no one was coming? Did he try to walk until he collapsed, his body giving out before he even realized he was done? I've been out in storms like that since then. I know what it's like to be caught in the cold, feeling the wind cut through your layers, knowing that if you take a wrong step, you might not make it back. And now, every time I see the snow start to fall, I wonder how many more bodies are out there, waiting for the thaw. Camping was something I had done all my life. I wasn't the most experienced outdoorsman, but I knew my way around the basics. Pitching a tent, starting a fire, filtering water. I enjoyed it because it gave me a break from everything. No phone, no noise, no people. Just the woods, the night, and my own thoughts. That's why I went alone. This trip wasn't anything complicated. Just a 3-day solo hike through a national forest in the late summer. I picked a route that wasn't too remote, but also not overly popular. A few other hikers might be out there, but I wasn't expecting to run into many. I parked my car at the trailhead, shouldered my pack, and set off into the woods. The first day was uneventful. The trail was well marked, the weather was perfect, and I made good time. I passed a couple heading back toward the parking lot and asked how the trail ahead looked. They said it was clear. No issues. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing beside a slow-moving creek. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. Flat ground, easy access to water, and just far enough from the trail to feel secluded. I pitched my tent, set up my little stove, and had a simple meal before the sun dipped below the trees. I stayed up for a while, sitting by the fire and listening to the night sounds. The usual stuff. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Peaceful. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. Took me a second to figure out why. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving somewhere just outside my campsite. I stayed completely still, my breath shallow. I listened. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too heavy, too steady, and they weren't coming from the trail. They were circling my camp. I reached for my flashlight but stopped myself. I didn't want to make a sound. The footsteps moved closer, stopping just beyond the glow of the dying fire. I could barely make out a shadow through the thin fabric of my tent. Someone was standing there, watching. My mind raced. Was it a ranger? Another camper? Someone lost? Then, just as slowly as they had approached, the footsteps retreated. Whoever it was walked off into the trees, heading away from my tent. I lay there, frozen for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep again. Morning came, and the fear from the night before felt distant, almost unreal. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, stretching in the cool morning air. Then I saw them. Footprints. Large, booted prints in the dirt, circling my campsite. They hadn't come from the trail. They had come from the forest. I crouched down, examining them. Whoever had been there had walked around my tent more than once. I felt a cold unease settle in my gut. Whoever it was hadn't been lost. They hadn't stumbled into my camp by accident. They had been watching. I considered packing up and heading back to my car, but I shook off the thought. It was probably just some curious hiker. Maybe they had seen my fire and wanted to make sure I was okay but didn't want to wake me. I convinced myself it was nothing and pressed on. I hiked most of the day, putting miles between me and that first campsite. By late afternoon, I found another good spot. Deep in the woods, beside a ridge. Felt even more secluded. I went through the routine again. Tent up, fire going, dinner cooked. As the sky darkened, I forced myself to relax. Then, as I was about to turn in, something caught my eye. Across the fire, at the edge of the trees, something was carved into the bark of a tree. I hadn't noticed it before. I walked over, shining my flashlight on it. A single word, scratched deep into the wood. Stay! A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't seen any other signs of people all day.
No footprints.
No old campsites. Who had carved this? And when a voice in the back of my head whispered, maybe last night, maybe while you were sleeping. Asterisk, asterisk, I shook off the thought and told myself it was an old marking. Just some hiker messing around years ago. Still, I slept with my knife close at hand. By the third day, I was ready to be done. Something about this trip felt off. The woods, normally peaceful, felt different, like I was being watched. I barely saw any wildlife.
No deer, no squirrels.
Even the birds were quieter than usual. I hiked faster than normal, eager to get through the last stretch. By evening, I reached my final campsite. It was a small clearing with a fire ring, about 5 miles from the parking lot. One more night, then I'd be home. I set up camp quickly and ate without much thought. The moment the sun set, I felt on edge again. The trees seemed darker. The sounds of the forest felt muted. Then, as I sat by the fire, I heard something. A sound I hadn't heard since the first night. Footsteps. I snapped my head toward the noise. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing. Just darkness. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, heart pounding, scanning the woods. And then I saw it. A figure just barely visible in the shadows. Standing still, watching me. They were just beyond the reach of my light. I couldn't make out a face, just the outline of a person. I stood there, gripping my knife, waiting for them to move. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the figure stepped backward, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire burning and sat with my back against a tree, knife in hand, waiting for the first sign of daylight. At the first hint of dawn, I packed my gear in record time. I didn't eat, didn't even bother to check my surroundings. I just wanted to be out. I hit the trail at a near jog, my pack bouncing against my back. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. The hike back to the parking lot should have taken 2 hours. I did it in 1. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there, catching my breath. Then, just before starting the engine, I looked up. Across the road, at the edge of the woods, someone stood there, not moving, just watching. I didn't wait. I started the car and tore out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. They weren't lost. They weren't just another hiker. They had followed me, and they had waited.